Good morning, everyone. My name is Rory Brown, and I'm from Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. I'm delighted to welcome you to our Winter Learning Programme. This offers a series of knowledge-sharing sessions of topics that you've told us are of interest to you. Today's event is called Later Living, Including an Intergenerational Approach. Before we start, I will introduce you to the Local Government Capacity Centre team and share a word from our CEO. So next slide, please. So this Winter Learning Programme is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre, which launched in the summer of last year. That summarises who we are and what we do. We've launched the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities need most support and how this can best be delivered. I'm delighted to open this session for Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre by showing you this welcome message from our new Chief Executive, Peter Denton. As you can see, Peter is committed to ensuring Homes England supports your work and shares expertise, experience and skills to get more homes built. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides are an agenda and breakdown of today's session. So this one is on the morning session. Please note that there's a 5-minute break in this morning session between Jeremy's presentation at 11:55 and this beginning of his second presentation at 12 o'clock, just to give you a few moments to refresh yourself. We'll be finishing this morning session with panel Q&A, and this afternoon, if we move on to the next slide, please, we'll be doing a very similar structure with a panel Q&A at the end. But this afternoon, I will be drawing this session to a close as well. So without further ado, I will hand over to my partner, Neil Reevely, to begin today's session.
Thank you very much, Rory, and welcome to everyone. And thank you very much to Homes England for both organising the session and inviting me to take part. So as already said, my name is Neil Reevely. I work with the Care and Health Improvement Programme, sometimes known as the CHIP programme, which is a programme overseen by ADAS and the LGA, hosted by the LGA, but actually funded by the Department of Health and Social Care. My role there is both supporting directors of adult services in local authorities, but particularly at a national level, being the housing lead for the programme. I also perhaps should say I wear a couple of hats in addition to that, really. So I do chair the Housing Policy Network for the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, ADAS. I am a former Director of Health, Housing and Adult Services in a slightly former life. But I also should sort of declare an interest in where I'm also a board member of Housing 21 and Carbon Homes. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So I think from the LGA and ADAS's perspective, the importance of housing to health and social care can't be overstated, really. And many of us have been working in this area for many decades, and we're really pleased to see, in a way, that at the current time, the time is coming, really, in terms of the stars are aligning to be able to make a real impact in this area. Housing is critical to delivering the health and social care agenda, and as we'll probably go on to discuss, it always has been. That's not something new, even though, as I say, fortunately, sort of this bit of the agenda has crept up the importance area, particularly for government and others. Housing is vital to supporting independence. That's why it's so important. It's not important just because of an organisational importance, if you like. This is because of the impact it has on people and people we want to see to have, living an independent life as possible. And independent living ensures that people have less reliance on health and care services, which of course is what we would all aspire to. Housing impacts on the physical and mental well-being and health inequalities, and I think that hasn't been sort of more demonstrated than during the past couple of years, and during the pandemic we've heard some of the stories around the impact on people's mental well-being if they haven't had a good quality home to live in and access to the sort of facilities we would hope people can have. So housing impacts on that substantially. And of course, over decades, housing options have evolved to meet new and emerging demand and aspirations. Those of you, some people on the seminar today may have heard me speak before. I may know some of you, and you'll have heard me say before that my personal view is that there is no need for institutional care models in this day and age. There is at the moment, because we haven't produced enough of the new models. But who in the audience today is looking forward to moving into their care home at some point in the future? I suspect none of us in that regard. And what we know is, and some of the examples we'll hear about today, is there is no need for that to happen. We have the models available, and we have the wherewithal to create independent living options for all people, and hopefully this, what the result of programs like with Homes England and through other government settings, we can really make an impact in that regard in the not too distant future. These sorts of solutions also contribute to much wider community solutions. Those of you who have been involved, whether that's about extra care for older people, retirement housing, or whatever, the wider community solutions that can provide, whether that's services that can reach out from those particular settings to other local people, or whether it's about providing facilities that don't already exist in that local community. That can be different in urban and rural areas. Some of the rural areas I've worked in the past, for example, it can provide the replacement for the village shop, the post office, etc., as well as providing much needed accessible housing for older people and others. So it does contribute very much, or can contribute very much, to those wider community solutions. And certainly those of you involved in planning new schemes would very much encourage people to think about what else does this community need, how can this provide some of those solutions. But most importantly, as I said earlier, it's instrumental in improving outcomes and providing the best outcomes for people, carers, and their families. If we can move on. So some of the current issues that exist, if you like, certainly in terms of existing housing stock, less than 7% of homes are accessible, and they are accessible to visitors, not just accessible to live in, but even just for visitors. Only 7% of homes are accessible, and therefore adapting and repairing homes is clearly very, very important. But also, with that number, as we look to new supply, then the accessibility of all new supply, it is a fact that the vast majority of housing we'll have in 50 years' time is already built and is already here. So we've got a lot of shortfall to make up in terms of accessibility, which I think is why the LGA, ADAS and others are really encouraging the government through its recent consultation to ensure that the regulations in the future ensure many more homes are accessible, so that we can try to make up that shortfall. And of course, there is a massive undersupply currently of all of accessible homes in all tenures, and particularly for older people. The Local Government Association in 2017 published a document, Housing Our Ageing Population, which is still very relevant, but in fact, working with the Housing LIN, we're going to be updating that document in the coming months, which will further exemplify some of the things we'll be talking about today. But since 2017, and in 2017, 11.7 million people made up the over 65s in our population, and that will rise by over 3 million people by 2025 to 14.3 million people, a 22% rise, even in that relatively short time. And by then, 1 in 5 people in our population will be over 65, rising to 1 in 4 by the time we get to 2050. And whilst the majority of those people will live in mainstream houses, and that's why both new build accessibility is so important, but also the adaptability and the opportunity of adapting and repairing existing homes, it also requires a massive increase, in my view, of some of the what we might call more specialist housing provision, retirement housing, extra care housing, and so on. And some of you will be aware that only 0.6% of housing in this country is specialist housing with care, which is 10 times less than in places like New Zealand, the US, Australia, where 5% of over 65s live in some form of housing with care. So clearly the demand is there, and there's a massive undersupply in this area. Some of the issues I think are less about, I put capital funding on this slide, but actually what we're finding is lots of institutional investors and others are lining up and recognise both the demand and opportunity for new supply. What people often require is sort of the confidence of planning authorities, of other parts of the local authority, social services, etc., of ensuring that the sort of ongoing commitments can be met. Planning can also be a bit of an issue. Sometimes we've struggled to engage appropriately. So from a social care perspective, my encouragement is for directors of adult social services to engage. We have lots of great examples, and Julie Ogley, who'll be speaking a little bit after me, in central Bedfordshire, is a fantastic example of how the planning system can be best prepared to enable and encourage the new supply that we need. I've mentioned some of the revenue and support services issues, which hopefully I'll return to because the new sort of care white paper may help us to address some of this area. But as well as those issues, as I've already mentioned, particularly from Central Bedfordshire, but others, there are lots of good practice examples to draw upon. And certainly the Care and Health Improvement Programme, as I've said, of which I'm part, how our whole reason for being, if you like, is to share good practice, known as sector-led improvement, how we can help the whole system, other local authorities draw from those great examples and provide the evidence that people need to help resolve these issues. Next slide, please. So some of the national context, I won't dwell a lot on this slide, but if people sort of need to draw on the fact that the policy sort of out there supports what we're trying to achieve, then the policy landscape is there, right going from people like Marmot and the Marmot Review through to the various both health policies, social care policies, planning policies, and so on. So the mix of policy context certainly supports places who want to really drive forward this agenda. And next slide, please. But I'll focus particularly on social care reform, because this is probably the most recent policy development in this regard. And prior to the white paper being published, ADAS and the LGA were making a strong case for housing being part of any social care reform. In fact, the Care Act 2014 already has a strong housing focus. Unfortunately, the massive cuts that people have experienced in local government over the last decade and beyond have meant that mostly some of these preventative elements of the Care Act haven't been able to be delivered. But there is a strong focus on housing in the Care Act. So the fundamental legislation that already exists for around social care already supports this agenda. And through ADAS, particularly in the lead up to the white paper, we were really advocating for these new models of care to be seen as a key part of the reform agenda. ADAS published nine statements to shape reform, and housing being central to every decision about care was picked up in Statement 5, and I'm pleased to say a statement that was actually made by a former president of ADAS, James Bullion, was actually picked up by the white paper, and that every decision about care is a decision about housing is a phrase that has been replicated in the white paper, and so has the support of the sector in being a real drive. There is, of course, a link to the broader national economic drivers. What we fundamentally believe is that this isn't just a need and a cost, if you like, to society and to government or whatever. This is an opportunity to invest, not just meeting, as I said, a social care social care need. And so there's a major economic driver which we're also promoting to people like the Treasury to say this is a good way to help both building back better, building back stronger, but also the levelling up agenda. But it does need a whole system approach. So planning, health, housing, and adult social care. That whole system thinking and leadership. Next slide, please. So the new white paper is called People at the Heart of Care, and I believe that housing is indeed at the heart of the white paper, and these are some of the key areas of housing that have been that are proclaimed in the white paper just published in the last couple of months. So it is asking for strong leadership and partnerships across health, care and housing. We're also keen to draw in health, and people will be aware of the new health structures, the ICSs, integrated care systems, where they are being asked to engage with housing and ensure that housing is strategically part of their plans for the future. And the new partnership boards that will be part of ICSs, we're asking and making the case for good, solid, strong links to housing in various ways to ensure that housing can both influence the ICS, but housing in my experience is an offer that is being made to health. This is housing saying, actually, we've got a part to play here, and we can help deliver the health priorities that are needed in our region. So this is not just an ask of health. This is a strong offer to our health partners of how housing can make a real difference. So we were really pleased to see that the white paper also makes this point to our health colleagues, and we would hope that this will be part of any assurance processes that follow with integrated care systems. But so there is a critical role for integrated care partnerships in driving necessary integration, both through the development of local strategies, but also in the delivery of services. And we know housing associations and local authorities providing housing in particular are very much at the solution finding part of the system in local places. It is important that local areas agree to plan and embed housing in those broader health and care strategies in order that we can boost the supply of supported housing. The white paper does talk about that it will invest at least £300 million up to 2026 to deliver the white paper by integrating housing into local health and care strategies. This £300 million will be starting to be available from April of this year, and we are already in discussions with the Department of Health and Social Care about how they can get that money out of the door, in effect, because they're keen to make as big a difference as they can up to 2026 for a number of reasons, but including demonstrating to the Treasury that point I made before, that this is an investment opportunity that will really deliver improvements both for people, for health and social care systems, but also the sort of the national economy. £300 million doesn't sound a lot if that was about money for capital investment, but that's not what the 300 million is about. This is about money to help, as I've already said, integrating housing into local health and care strategies. The capital investment will still be there through things like the Care and Support Specialised Housing Fund, which the Department of Health and Social Care provides, but is administered through Homes England. They've confirmed that money will be still available, on top of course, the money that Homes England already have with them for the affordable housing programmes and the accessible homes within that. So government, in effect, putting some of its money where its mouth is in relation to capital. But as I've already said, I know from my work with housing associations and others, capital investors are lining up to invest in this particular area. So we don't think capital is the big barrier. It's actually having the right plans in place, having the confidence of whole systems, really saying this is what we want, this is how we can make it happen in our place, that will be the key to unlocking lots of that investment. As we already mentioned, investing in existing homes is clearly a priority as well, because, again, just to repeat what we said before, the vast majority of homes that will be there in 50 years' time are there now, and therefore we need to support people not just in right sizing when they want and need to move with good examples, but also how we can support them to live in the place that they already live in. And the white paper has confirmed disabled facilities grant money and to increase and be sustained, and I think the case can be made for that to improve even more in terms of the amount of investment available. The white paper talks about a new service to make minor repairs and changes in people's homes. This likely be sort of labelled a handy person's service, and they're keen to move that forward. And the point I made earlier, the white paper alludes to about the fact the government will be announcing the accessibility standards in new mainstream homes in the future following the consultation. I think some of us had hoped that alongside this, the publication of this white paper, they might have said a little bit more about the accessibility standards, but we're still awaiting that. We're still awaiting that announcement. And last but by no means least, improve information and advice. Crucially important. What we tend to find is access to good quality information and advice, particularly linking to people's housing and housing options and housing requirements, not always there and not always available to people. And interestingly, quite often not always available to those outside of the sort of social and rented sector. Sometimes if you're in touch with housing associations, in touch with sort of handy person service or whatever, quite often you can get access to that information and advice. Sometimes it's the people who we sometimes refer to as self-funders, those people who aren't reliant on others. Where do they go for advice, and how can they access it? Not always easily. So improve information and advice, a key part of what we'd like to see. Next slide, please. So just finally from me to say what that all comes together to do, and what we're certainly within the LGA and ADAS encouraging people to say is that strategic approaches are needed. And as I've said, I'm pleased to say some money will be available not in the not too distant future for local authorities to be in the lead to support strategic planning across with partners in these areas. But we need to see those strategic approaches embedded in local plans, not just in local plans, but in the economic plans of local areas. A great opportunity, we believe, in town and city centre renewal. Lots of older people benefit from living in town and city centres. It's also good for local town and city centre economies. Some research available there to say actually older people spend their money closer to where they live, etc. So if you're interested in town and city centre renewal, actually older persons housing at the centre of that isn't a bad idea. We do believe those investment opportunities will flow from that. Obviously, housing strategies need to point out and identify how we can take this forward. Integrated care systems with health, already mentioned. Joint strategic needs assessments and health and wellbeing strategies. Sorry for the acronyms. BCF stands for Better Care Fund, but that's a joint fund administered across health and social care. Again, housing at the heart of the guidance around how we use those joint funds across health and social care. Clearly, we need housing to be and particularly older persons' housing needs to be at the heart of adult social care plans and strategies, and within those plans and strategies, particular client groups, older people, learning disabilities, etc., and how we deliver housing services. So we're keen, we being LG and ADAS in this regard, really keen to both support this approach and support people to make this approach to really make a difference. And I'm now looking forward to listening to the rest of the speakers for today. So thank you very much for listening.
So, good morning, everyone. I'm Julie Ogley. I'm the Director of Adult Social Care and Health and Housing at Central Bedfordshire Council. And I guess that gives it away, doesn't it? I'm in a unitary council, and I think in many ways that makes the agenda around housing and social care easier to deliver. Anyway, what I wanted to do this morning is to share our experience in Central Bedfordshire, and hopefully it will pick up on many of the points that Neil's raised. So next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So I just wanted to say a little bit about Central Bedfordshire. That's our current population is about 290,000 now. We're certainly we're growing, and we're sort of delivering over 2,000 houses per annum. So we are sort of growing. And interestingly, about 73% of the households in Central Bedfordshire are owner-occupied. That's us on the left. You can see we're sort of a spread-out council. We've sort of got Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire, Bedford and Luton. They're our nearest neighbours. And what's interesting is we don't have a major central population. We have a number of market towns, as you can see, and a big percentage of our population is rural. Also very interesting on the right-hand side is that whilst we've recently agreed our local plan to 2035, and that's identified just over 39,000 in terms of growth of housing. In terms of where we're going, we're also part of the Oxford-Cambridge arc, and we're anticipating that growth in terms of housing, but also obviously in terms of employment, is going to increase significantly as well. So I think the message from me is be prepared and take the opportunities as they develop. So next slide, please. So then what's our approach to housing and social care been? I think the council has accepted, the wider determinants of health and just how important actually housing is to people's health and well-being. And importantly, and this sometimes is a bit unusual for directors of adult social care, that we need to think about the whole market and not just those people requiring public subsidy. And in fact, that chimes very well with the Care Act as it's currently implemented, but the thinking in terms of moving forward, the transformation and the reform of adult social care, and not just thinking about the sort of housing that's maybe supported housing or extra care, but also thinking about general needs housing as well. And Neil, I would slightly have a different view at the moment, that we need to also think about care homes and nursing homes, especially given what you were saying about the 0.5% in terms of retirement specialist housing. So we really do still need some of those services as we move forward in transformation of adult social care. I can see the requirement around care homes to be diminishing. But the council, because it's accepted the strategy and the business case that if we provide the right sort of housing for people, not only are they going to have better lives and better outcomes, but also in terms of the spending of the council, it is more cost effective for people to be living in their own homes, generally speaking, than to be cared for in residential or nursing homes. And that we've been very keen to make use of the council's assets, now come on to that more, but also to engage and develop with the market and to develop partnerships as well. And we're flexible in terms of the delivery model and flex that depending on the circumstances. Next slide, please. So what we have done for older people is to develop an investment prospectus. So this sets out our aspirations in terms of, and I'm talking about older people at this point, in terms of accommodation for older people. Its purpose is to attract investment into our area, and sort of focuses on the types of accommodation that we, following our assessment, felt are most needed and where they are. And that in my social care language, we would probably call that a market position statement. But I've learned through my planning colleagues and my regeneration colleagues that actually a better term is an investment prospectus. And the document that we published is available on that link. And I know that you'll all receive these slides later, so be able to follow that. So next slide, please. So we divided Central Bedfordshire into a number of areas, into 4 areas, and this is Chiltern Vale. So the prospectus describes each area and provides information that we think that investors will find useful in terms of the numbers of people living there, in terms of the age profile and how we expect that to move forward, to project it forward, and then in terms of the sorts of tenure that people are living in within the area. And we also list the developments that we're aware of, plus other important documents. So next slide, please. And again, talking about both the extra care supply and demand and the care home supply and demand. And this is quite an old photo now, which actually shows the first extra care scheme apartment, set of apartments for rent and for shared ownership that Central Bedfordshire built and opened in 2017. Well, it's the Queen opened it in 2017. Of course, we have people living in there for 2016. So across Central Bedfordshire, we've got these market opportunities and investment opportunities that would be investors, whether they're builders, construction people, whether they're care home operators or housing associations or care providers can make informed decisions about. And we know that people have used this documentation with banks to secure investment. So next slide, please. So behind all of that, of course, we've carried out quite a bit of research. So we've researched into the housing needs of older people, and also then how that's formulated our approach to the planning system. And I've been here 13 years now. I've always had an interest in housing, and in fact I've been a director of social care and housing for about 15 years, but I'd never got close to our planners until I moved to this council and really understood their role and how they can help us achieve better outcomes for people across the whole sort of population in Central Bedfordshire, in my case. Next slide, please. So we carried out research with older people. We didn't do this ourselves. We got some consultants in to do this. And we were looking at their propensity to move, their preferred tenure type, drivers for considering a move, preferred housing types, and then in particular we were interested in downsizing. And again, that research is available on that link, and I'm going to summarise some of that on the next couple of slides. So next slide, please. So in terms of propensity to move, now I think this is really interesting. When I first looked at this, I was a bit half empty, I have to say, in terms of my glass, and looked at the not prepared to move. But actually, if you look at this, we've seen 8% already moved, the percentage planning to move, and those not but being prepared to move. And when I and the council first was proposing that big independent scheme that we have, the independent living scheme, there was a lot of concern about whether older people would move. We had a 94-year-old person move that was really a very successful outcome, and that lady gave up a 3-bedroom house that she was under occupying that clearly went to a family. So I wouldn't start with any assumptions about what people are thinking and their propensity. What I would say is that the offer needs to be right. And of course, do you know what everyone said to us at the beginning? Actually, we want to move into a big bungalow on a small plot. And that's exactly the sort of thing that builders tend not to want to build. So next slide, please. So again, I think I've covered some of this. So many people do want to downsize, but as I said, the design, the tenure, price and location are really, really important. And if we don't get the offer right, then people won't move and they'll stay where they are. So next slide, please. So what does that mean for us? So we've done the research, we've looked at the needs, we've looked at the population, and we've looked at what people are saying to us. So this is where we got to in terms of the analysis. So, a need for 3,650 specialist homes, a need for 5,400 mainstream housing downsizer homes. And that downsizer part is something that we've not cracked yet. And we're working really hard to understand what a good downsizer home might be. And some of the designs that we've had, I have to say, are just bungalows. And actually, I think we can do a bit better than that. So in terms of, you look at the numbers of housing, of types of housing that we need, so that equates to about 23% of the planned housing growth for Central Bedfordshire. You can see therefore why we might be really keen to have good relationships with our planners and our sort of housing strategy colleagues. And again, about 3/4 of those for owner occupation. And again, the big win-win for the council, not just in terms of its social housing and its affordable housing, but also for the wider market, is the equivalent, that would mean the equivalent release of mainly larger family homes back into the market. So next slide, please. So that you can establish the policy. So how do we actually deliver? So we're really fortunate in Central Bedfordshire that we've got a housing revenue account. We're a significant landlord in our own right. And that's been helping us to develop affordable homes across Central Bedfordshire. And the council has committed land and general fund as well, to general fund capital, to non-housing schemes or non-housing funded schemes. We've also formed New Vista Homes, which is a housing development company to develop open market homes on council-owned land, but also to meet the gap. We've got sort of the people on the housing register that are not in suitable housing, and then we've got a very large group of households that are paying on average more than £38 a week more than housing benefit, and for their accommodation, and we know that that's a problem that's just round the corner. So part of the rationale for creating the housing company is to try and address that what would you call that middle group of people that could find themselves falling into the housing register and falling into homelessness if we're not careful. Similarly, we created Care is Central, which is a care service, and I'm pleased to say that they take their first contract on the 1st of February, so that's next week, to take on some of the housing support in some of our extra care schemes across Central Bedfordshire. They will also take on the running of a couple of care homes that the council is in the process of building as well. But it's really important that we develop and continue to develop the relationships with the general and specialist housing providers in both the public and private sectors. And being frank, we've lost a couple of years, or we've only been ticking along because of the pandemic, which has had, as I'm sure you'll all appreciate, a very profound impact on both housing and adult social care delivery. But what has been really important for us is participating in master planning, and we've been very involved with the thinking about how Central Bedfordshire will shape up as we go forward. And whilst we're revising the older person's prospectus, we're also in the process of developing one for working age adults with care and support needs. So again, we can help to shape and steer the market in Central Bedfordshire to meet some of the housing and care needs that we feel are not being currently met, but to address the future as well. So next slide, please. So what do we think the benefits are? Well, we think it's more inclusive, and pre the pandemic, some of the work in some of our extra care schemes are actually fabulous, with sort of local schools and lots of volunteering and lots of social activity that's sort of self-generating. It doesn't need the council's housing colleagues or social care colleagues. People themselves are forming these sort of natural communities, not just for people living in schemes, but for people living around as well. And we're really clear that we want accessible homes to be accessible to all. And that's a big discussion that we've been having with our planners and with our partners about what that means, and certainly New Vista Homes in terms of how it, meets and goes beyond the actual requirements of the council in terms of the design of its housing. But we know that we need to be pragmatic in terms of responding to the needs that are emerging. And, we are in discussion with our children's colleagues as well about, we've had a great focus on older people, but what about the younger population? And how do we support young people leaving care? We have some offers, but how do we make those more bespoke? And then one of the challenges for us, I mentioned earlier that we've got a rural, most people live in the rural parts of central Bedfordshire. So how do we prove the business case for some schemes in our smaller villages? And again, we're working with New Vista Homes to think about how we might approach that. So next slide, please. So Neil's already mentioned what some of the structural barriers are around the funding streams, and particularly the 55 plus, whilst in fact in schemes that there's at least a couple of generations. If we have some people around 55 moving, but also people living there in their 80s and 90s, and that brings with it its challenges as well as its opportunities. But I would agree with Neil, and I suspect Jeremy will be saying this as well, that there is more that we need to do nationally to ease some of the issues around, whether it's in planning or whether it's in funding streams, around the barriers to generating better offers for people. And, we're still very much at the forming stage, aren't we, nationally? We know we're near where New Zealand and Australia are. And I mentioned that in downsizing and looking at some of the very pedestrian schemes that have been developed. And some of it is common sense. What would make me, think about downsizing? Well, I'm not going to share a bathroom with anyone, so each bedroom would be en suite. And that's a basic, isn't it, really? We expect that now in our care homes. We expect it to be in our extra care scheme. But why are we thinking about sharing facilities? I just think we need to open our ears and eyes and think quite differently. And what I've really learned over the months here in central Bedfordshire is the importance of the decision makers. It's all right having a great idea as an assistant director or a director, but really the decision makers are the elected members. Our planners are absolutely crucial, as are our asset colleagues, in terms of making things real. And then the relationship that we have with our housing associations. And, a couple of the housing associations have invested in big schemes in central Bedfordshire. And I'm really pleased to see that. But we're all on a different stage in this journey. I'm hoping that today I'm talking to the people that are already convinced and the champions of this. But I know that some people require a bit more thought in terms of how we approach this and further back in their journey and need to understand what the real benefits are. So we've started producing videos and other such aids to show people what the potential is and how living in different sorts of forms of housing can be really exciting and beneficial. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to show you this development. Now this is next to a leisure centre in Flitwick, one of our market towns. And if we go on to the next slide. This just shows that this is for local people. It just shows where it is, but what's around it in central Bedfordshire in terms of Flitwick. The next slide, please. So this is what we're currently on site with. So we've let the contract to Farron's, and they're now on site doing the provisional enabling works. So it will have a 72 place care home, an extra care scheme with 88 apartments for shared ownership and rent, a short breaks facility for adults offering 8 places, and a number of downsizer properties, and they're on the right of the screen. Now, at the moment, we're still considering those because actually we're using that bit of land as the compound, but that will be developed by New Vista Homes. And again, we're really trying to think about what a downsizer property might be. And the positives here are now the shared public access facilities, including health rooms, and the local GP practice will be spending time within this development as well. It is wrapped round by diverse sort of landscape and green space, and and we've sort of, as you would expect, we're building to passive house standards, and also we've got green space, green roofs, living walls, etc. All that sort of thing that those sort of developments that will enhance people's living experience. So next slide, please. Right, so that's a quick run through what we've been doing in Central Bedfordshire. Much more to do. We're on a journey, but we've not finished that journey. And I'm really pleased now to be handing over to a great ally that's provided a lot of support for us in Central Bedfordshire, and that's Jeremy Porteous.
Oh, thanks, Julie. Great presentation, and really delighted to be here. For those of you who don't know, and those of you who've been involved with Homes England and its predecessors, Homes and Communities Agency and the Housing Corporation in the past, I'm a former chair of the Vulnerable and Older People's Advisory Group, and therefore work very closely within the predecessor organisations and indeed Homes England to really champion and promote better quality housing and care and support for older and vulnerable adults living in a variety of affordable and mainstream housing, both in the specialist housing sector and in the general needs provision as well. Next slide, please. If you haven't come across the housing, then I'm going to be presenting in two halves. This very short introduction just gives you some background about our work, building on what Neil and Julie have said. And then after the short break, I shall be giving some examples of sort of the exemplary examples of practice that we've captured through the LIN in our networks over the last 20 years or so. If you aren't aware of the Housing Learning Improvement Network, Housing LIN for short, we're formerly part of the Change Agent team in the Department of Health, which at that time had a dedicated capital fund, which was sifted by the Homes and Communities Agency to enable further investment into local communities on a range of extra care and supported housing options for people with a learning disability or with mental well-being issues. And as part of that programme, we brought together adult social care, health, both in the PCGs and the acute sector at that time, across England, Scotland and Wales, to share innovative practice. And we continue to do so through both our online services, both in terms of the website and our comprehensive database of resources that are all freely available, as well as at the moment a number of online webinars that we call happy hours. In fact, if anybody joined us last night, you will have seen some of the fantastic work that 13 are doing in the Northeast and the work they're doing, particularly around Middlesbrough, to create their Living Well strategy. So our approach is very much about connecting people's ideas and resources together. And we do this for a number of reasons. And the next slide will show those. Next slide, please. We want to support the change and work closely with local authorities, housing operators, housing associations, indeed investors and planners to do a number of things. And I call these my 8 I's. The first is very much about how we can support the influencing at a national level. And Neil outlined some of the sort of the key policy developments and formations that are currently taking place. And we've been very much instrumental in building on the original work commissioned by the HCA, as it was, to develop the happy design principles. And indeed, many people may not be aware that Kevin McGeer hosted that through the HCA and chaired by Lord Best. And ever since, we've maintained the influence and building on those initial happy reports to now have 5. And indeed, there's a new inquiry to look at shared ownership. Part of that is very much building on what Julie was just saying about how to include and involve the local community. So that inclusive approach about how do we co-design. And the perspectives that she shared with you just a moment ago and the work being developed around multi-generational, intergenerational living is also paralleled with their work around developing and engaging with local communities around more community-led approaches as well. And we've been very fortunate to support Julie and the team in developing some practice tools which we can post on the chat box to make those more freely available. And again, as people have said in the chat room, about what is the type of intelligence that can help people make those right-sizing, downsizing decisions. And we work very closely with Neil and colleagues to support local councils and operators to better understand and predict the type of demand for a range of housing solutions, both more age-friendly solutions that can support people in their own homes, or if they wish to move to a more appropriate accommodation because of access, adaptability, or because of a long-term condition. Making some more information available around the types of supply side issues around specialist housing. And we've worked closely with the LGA and ADAS to develop various tools to support local authorities take those forward. We have a bank of innovative practice on our website. We share a lot of information through our regular bulletins. They come out every Friday afternoon, Friday late morning normally actually. Please do sign up to get our weekly bulletin and get involved. It's a free membership. And our whole sort of virus is very much how to look at good practice to adapt to local settings and to support the learning to enable local authorities, health commissioners, operators, and indeed users of services develop more appropriate housing choices. Some of the issues also about how we evidence that and make sure that we can demonstrate both the care efficiency that Neil and Julie highlighted, but also the housing gain and the wider benefit to the broader economy. And our work is very much with the Local Government Association has picked out some of the sort of the key findings in relation to that health and care dividend. So, for example, whether it's around reducing admissions into inpatient or A&E care services within the NHS, supporting more appropriate and timely care and support at home through the use of domiciliary care or floating support services, or indeed GP services, as well as thinking about the revolving door of hospital discharge and readmissions. We've done a lot of work with local communities to better understand the financial modelling around that. So whether it's the Almshouse Association, where we did some work which got published at the end of last year, which demonstrated that almshouses significantly contribute to their local economy by sort of freeing up about £45 million a year to local health and social care services, or whether it's the work in Local Government Association in Southampton, where it's about diverting and avoiding admissions into more of that institutional setting that Neil highlights. We've got some of the evidence, which is all freely available on our website. The next slide just gives you a flavour of the sort of areas that we're very heavily involved in at the moment. Obviously, COVID and the impact on people living in supported and extra care housing. We've been engaging with government on that. Neil and Julie have highlighted, and I see Jay and others in the chat, about the real cost benefits, but also what are the capital constraints around developing and building more accessible housing design. As part of our influencing work, we're part of the Home Coalition with Habenteg and the Centre for Ageing Better. Neil touched on the DFG and the money that's set aside, but there's also guidance that will be coming out this spring from government for local authorities on the administrations of the DFG. And we may touch on later some of the issues around fire safety. And again, on health and social care, that integration piece is critical, but I'm not going to dwell on these because I'm sure this is stuff that Neil's already touched on, and I'll come back to after the short break in a moment. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Rory now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Jeremy. So yeah, as Jeremy suggested, we're going to take a 5-minute quick comfort break, and we will reconvene a couple minutes past midday, where I'll be handing back over to Jeremy to begin his second part. Okay, thank you. Right, I think we will continue. Hopefully Jeremy's back with us. He is fantastic. Over to you, Jeremy.
Right, if I could have the next slide then. Thanks. As I said, this is a presentation in 2 parts. I've sort of very much, first of all, sort of outlined some of the work that the LIN is involved in. This is just all going to build on a bit more of what Neil and Julie have been saying. And I don't want to sort of repeat a lot of that, but there's some really sort of key sort of findings that are really relevant in terms of planning for an ageing population. And I don't mean just older people, I mean for all ages. But in terms of older adults in the UK, about a third live in ordinary dwellings. So it's not a typical specialist housing. I think Julie sort of referred to that. We have a significant undersupply of that. And as Neil highlighted, about 1 in 4 are older adults expected to grow by 2037. And this is something that also came through a recent commission undertaken by the Social Care Institute for Excellence. And it also focused on issues around the older old. In fact, we're going to have a significant rise in centenarians, but also for those people over 85, it's going to grow to over 3.2 million over the next 25 years or so. But coming back sort of more locally and sort of looking at what the current supply of housing is for older adults in particular, especially within the retirement housing sector, we already have about just under 3/4 of a million homes for older adults in the retirement living setting, and that includes arms houses, includes our abbey fields, includes extra care and sheltered housing. But the work that Neil alluded to, that the local government association commissioned back in 2017-18 and is going to be reviewed now this spring, showed at that time that we needed an annual uptake of specialist housing and age designated housing of 34,000 units per annum. In reality, we've been developing as a nation between 5,000 and 7,000. Of those, about half of those are affordable housing funded through grants, either through the Affordable Housing Programme or the Department of Health Care and Support Specialised Housing Programme. And at the same time, we know that there is a real need to think about a mid-market solution. So we're also seeing a growth in options around PRS, outright ownership, and indeed shared ownership for older adults as well. Next slide, please. And we also know that there is a higher likelihood that older adults will live alone. And in fact, one of the things that's come through COVID is sort of the impact of living in group living in community settings, where there's been a wider benefit in living in terms of social networks and maintaining those through the coronavirus. But people are more likely to live alone. And again, the work that Sky showed is that this has been exacerbated by COVID. Next slide. So, picking up on some of that, there are some real sort of key interventions that are needed to help build a better supply, but also a better quality and range of provision. We've heard already about the Affordable Homes Programme within the Homes England, but also the Greater London authorities. About 10% of that funding we know nationally is allocated for supported and specialist housing. As Neil talked on, there is renewed money being made available from next financial year for Care and Support Specialised Housing Fund. It's a fund that's been available for at least 4 or 5 years now, and postdates the Extra Care Housing Fund, again administered by Homes England and GLA, to enable operators working closely with their local authority partners to identify the need for a provision of housing options. There's also funding, a small pocket of funding that's available through NHS England and some of the capital. And the monies available for that is very much specifically targeted at specialist housing, and particularly for people with a learning disability, to meet some of the building the right support and right home priorities that NHS England and the Department of Health have set out for looking at campus closures and re-providing a lot of the institutional care and residential care for people with a learning disability and or autism. But also, if you are working in local authorities, we're also seeing a number more looking at the one public estate, looking at use of land, looking at planning to see whether there are wider opportunities for both infill sites as well as major developments and reuse of existing sites, both mainly brownfield sites for larger developments of specialist housing. Tied in with this, the investment streams coming from affordable rents and shared ownership, and the older person's shared ownership, while I think has been sort of is still available, and some of the early leasehold schemes for the elderly, it's an area that I know Lord Best, through the latest inquiry, is keen to develop further. And linking into some of the sort of market position statements that Julie referred to, it's really critical in terms of looking at the housing supply, the planning and the land, how that will also impact on both the adult social care commissioning to look at the future revenue of care and support, as well as what that self-funder market might look like, whether that is for affordable rent, but also for other forms of tenure-based accommodation. So that could be mixed tenure, but also involving PRS, shared ownership, and as I said earlier, outright sale. There's a lot of design considerations, and Homes England have been working very closely with DLUC and Department of Health on things like the Home of 2030 to designing for healthy living is part of that, but also the revisions are part of the building regulations. And as Neil highlighted, that's set out both in the white paper, but also in the recent National Disability Strategy. And we await the conclusion of the consultation the government set out. We're also very keen to embed the happy design principles in the innovation pot and the extra care funding through cash programme that the Department of Health announced in the white paper, including issues leading to wheelchair accessibility. And again, there have been some questions and posts around that. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with the happy design principles, these are sort of like the fundamental reports that have come out over the last 12 to 15 years, very much based on international and UK-based examples of really high-quality housing, setting out a number of key design requirements to create accessible, adaptable and affordable homes for people in later life. The most recent report is very much looking specifically at supporting people with dementia, and we've adapted those 10 principles to make those dementia friendly. So if any of you have a particular interest in growing more dementia inclusive accommodation in your localities, please do draw attention to the dementia report, which in effect is Happy 5. The next slide, please. So those principles are very much sort of embedded in how to build beautiful, looking at a variety of contemporary and accessible and easily understood designs. And as I said, it's not just about specialist housing, making sure that these are age inclusive right from the outset. The key issue often coming through a number of the applications has been about the location, a need to improve the planning to match that identified shortfall, whether it's through those market position statements or those strategic housing market assessments. But also to think about where those rural versus urban and intergenerational examples are needed. And we'll hear more about some of those intergenerational developments during the course of today. A key sort of facet of the happy design principles is about being care ready, which touches back on those sort of integration piece that Neil referred to, but also what I was describing earlier about making the care efficiencies demonstrate the impact both on the quality of life of the individuals who live in care ready homes, but also the wider public benefit to the public purse around the health and social care dividend. And I would sort of urge you to have a look at both the reports that are available on that, both from the government, but also on the Housing England website, and particularly the report on the work in Southampton. And also what we haven't touched on is the growing use of technology, and I'll come back to that later, because I think one of the key, one of the 10 principles in the happy design principles is around technology enablement. And Lynn has been working closely with a number of providers, local authorities, to think about how to test some of that out in a new set of principles called TAPI, Technology for an Ageing Population. But it comes back to some of the issues we've already touched on around the lack of choice, about how we need to meet a variety of new lifestyles and new design requirements and meet future needs. And how we can encourage a better language as well about creating that attractive and choice-based sort of moves to enable people to right size and understand the benefits of right sizing. So the next slide, please. So just want to sort of conclude on some of the sort of facts and figures, and that work from the Sky Commission shows that, in fact, when people talk about their existing accommodation, very few people are actually fully aware of other forms of housing. People mainly have are very familiar with care homes and nursing homes, but less so with extra care or supported living or shared lives. So again, there's a need to think about what those positive aspects of a better homely setting are for people across a variety of tenures, and how we sell that and understand what their offer is. And that's what I think Julie's prospectus does really well. It sets out the business case, but also very much about what the offer is for customers in that locality. Next slide. So what we're seeing really is some emerging trends based on Julie and others' work. We're seeing a growing move towards co-living and multi-generational and intergenerational living. So whether it's some of the work here that's been shared with you, so there's and again, Jenny may touch on some of this later on today, some of the work that's been done with Orbit Housing in Stratford around the regeneration of the cattle market to create a mix of supply. So you've got the general needs on the left, the specialist housing, as well as the starter homes and help to buy arrangements, or perhaps some of the more co-living, which is for a younger cohort of adults in West London. The Collective, a really sort of impressive redesigned and re-engineered sort of block of apartments to create co-working and co-living space. We're also seeing a growth in an interest, and especially since COVID, of different community-led and co-housing. And again, Homes England have led a lot of this through the funding that's available for co-housing and community-led approaches. So whether it's the Ouch scheme in North London and Barnet, which is a longer-standing programme for supporting older women to live in a community in North Barnet, or whether it's the co-housing scheme at the bottom left in Stroud, which is more multi-generational, but in fact is very rapidly becoming a naturally occurring retirement community, as most people moved in 20, 30 years ago, and their children have left and they're now in their 50s and 60s and older. Or whether it's Marmalade Lane in Cambridge, there's all the award-winning co-housing scheme there, which is really creating a sort of waves around thinking about intergenerational co-living, co-housing and community-led approaches, predominantly for sale. The next slide, please. We're also seeing sort of new approaches to both retrofitting existing buildings as well as designing new. So whether it's sort of some of the award-winning schemes in Walthamstow or in Sussex or indeed in Keynsham, in Bath, the Chocolate Quarter, there's some really interesting developments at varieties of scale to look at different types of happy designs. These are really popular. There's often a long waiting list for people either to rent or to buy. But impressively, it's also enabling people to compress their dependency. So coming back to that health and social care game, people are finding that they live healthier and longer in these types of environments, and can be up to 4 or 5 years. And in fact, there's a report being launched tomorrow by the University of Bristol, which is looking about the impact of things like loneliness, quality of life, and what the benefits of good quality housing in diverse communities can offer. The next slide, please. So looking further afield, what are the options, and how can we help plan and prepare and build in the examples to help innovate, transform existing services, help you plan a new type of provision. Some of this is about how to improve the type of streetscaping there is to create the bumping places for community engagement, for greater community involvement. So whether it's the paintworks in Bristol, the top left, or some of the sort of the sundowner type of community that McCarthy and Stone and others are developing along the south coast, to some of the sort of European examples of using existing buildings and creating new frames to create new dwellings because of lack of space. So some of the brutalist on the top right is a series of sheltered housing bungalows that have been developed on an existing affordable housing block in Holland. Again, from Holland, using some of the pods that have been built for a sheltered provision as part of a mainstream offer. And I think the other thing is about how we got to really address climate change. So again, how do we use technology to think about energy efficiency, around thermal comfort, as well as thinking about future use and consumption of energy. So again, how do we build that in for an aging population? The agenda has to be grey, but it also has to be green. And we're also seeing a variety of new sort of types of modern bungalows are very popular. In fact, the major surveys by Mori show that about 2 million people would mostly prefer to move to a bungalow. We have a chronic shortage of bungalow provision in the UK, and I'm sure many of you will know the premiums on that. But that just gives you some ideas about the types of accommodation that's coming through. And the last slide is really, what does the future hold? Now, obviously, through COVID, cruises and things have been sort of put on hold for many. But again, some of the sort of lifestyle, the quality, and trying to create the ambience around the sort of provision and that offer is really important. So what I've tried to do is sort of show you how that policy connects to the practice and how we can use that to transform and create new types of provision and build on our existing stock and thoughts as well. Thank you. So I'm now going to pass over to Libby. Libby from Place for People. Really good to see you, Libby.
Hi, thanks, Jeremy. Afternoon, everybody. I had to think about whether it was morning or afternoon then. I'm very conscious that I'm following three speakers who've given us some fantastic context to what we're talking about today. I'm about to talk about the sort of practical delivery of some of the great opportunities that we've heard described and some of the aspirational approaches to intergenerational living. So first of all, the next slide, please. Just a little bit about Places for People Living Plus, who we are. We're part of the Places for People group, which, as the slide tells you, is one of the largest property management, leisure development and regeneration companies in the UK. We offer a really broad range of housing options and associated services, and we've provided accommodation, care and support services to people to support people to live independently for more than 50 years. In terms of our retirement living services, and that's where the vast majority of our interest in this particular subject today has been to date, we manage somewhere in the region of 3,000 retirement living homes, of which about 500 are extra care. But importantly, we have 75,000 people over 55 also living in our general needs accommodation. So I think that speaks to some of the detail that we've heard so far. Next slide, please. So why intergenerational living? And I think we've heard some really good statistics today. We've heard some really interesting points being made by the three previous speakers. I was particularly encouraged by Neil saying that we're at a time when stars are aligning, because too often I think we talk about being in a perfect storm. So I think that was a very nice contrast to that. And we've heard a lot about the value of housing in terms of health and independence, and that couldn't come at a better time in terms of health and social care being under such pressure, both in terms of the pandemic we've been living through and just the availability of frontline workers in terms of social care. So it's really good to hear about how important that housing is being recognised as a really important contributor. A big part of the move to improve people's health is in the reduction of social isolation, and we know that a lot of older people are reporting living in isolation and being lonely, but equally there have been studies that have said that almost twice as many 16 to 24-year-olds are feeling isolated. And therefore the bringing together of groups of people who are socially isolated has absolutely got to be a good thing in terms of increasing opportunity. At the moment, the vast majority of multi-generational living happens within individual families living in adapted properties. And there have been some really well documented developments around intergenerational living, particularly around students and particularly around medical students. So I think the Griffin Community Trust, which is a fairly well-known service at Barts Hospital, run by the medical school at Barts Hospital, it has just achieved 25 years longevity, and that gives medical students an opportunity to live alongside older people at a reduced rent in exchange for a number of hours per week spent socializing with older people. And I believe one of the original intentions of that scheme was to improve the empathy of medical students. I think it was recognized that by the time a number of them became qualified, they'd lost some of their skills around empathy. And so that's been a very successful project, but that is where the majority of deliberate intergenerational growth has happened in the UK. So living alongside different age groups will encourage joint activity. It will suggest that people become more independent and therefore need less support, certainly less paid for support, and therefore support in itself can become lighter touch and have less impact on a service that is under great strain. On-site guidance and support delivered by older people into younger people, which is varied by need. So friendship groups will develop, people will determine what level of need and support they need at the time. And it will tend to encourage a more dynamic urban mix. We've spoken quite a bit, our speakers today have talked quite a bit about regeneration of town centres. We absolutely know that at the moment that a number of retirement developments particularly are built on the edge of towns. There will be a different dynamic when we start to think more about intergenerational living, because there will be more need to be closer to retail, hospitality, and town centres. Next slide, please. So there's a very well documented, shortage of affordable housing generally. Again, previous speakers have spoken about people making that move to downsize or right size, and that we're 10 times, the market in the UK is 10 times smaller than that in other countries. That is partly cultural. That is partly as a result of people just not seeing the value necessarily in making that sort of final move, and indeed the availability of the right sort of property. And I think it was Julie that referenced everybody wants big bungalows on small plots. That would absolutely be the experience that we see when we're acquiring property, particularly strangely for younger people with needs around learning disabilities and autism equally. The two groups of customer that we're talking about here, younger and older people, have common requirements. They want to be close to the amenities, as I've just said. They want to have good transport links. They want to have transparency and visibility of the cost and affordability of their housing. Equally importantly, they want the value of, or the safety and security they feel of, on-site guidance and support. Increasingly, we're engaging with our customers when we're looking at new develops and new design to look at how communal space is used currently and how it will be better used in the future. And that's actually led to us reducing communal space in our extra care schemes rather than increasing. And we're looking at the use of outside space as well. So that often is determined by the availability of the land, of course, which I'll come on to talk about when we look at barriers to delivery. Jeremy has just described a whole host of different developments that are evidence of success. The very obvious ones that we've been talking about for feels like we've been talking about for a long time now are in the Netherlands, but also, as Jeremy's just described, the award-winning Marmalade Lane, which is mostly for sale opportunities. Next slide, please. So in terms of the opportunities that we're seeing, we've formed a partnership with a development partner that for us is proving to be really beneficial. As a registered provider, we haven't necessarily got the skills around land finding and securing land and access to contractors. So through working closely with a developer, that's proved to be really beneficial for us. We are working with our compliance teams to look at how we standardise our specification and how we align that to our specification within standard house types and components within our general needs business. And that's proving to be to give us a real economies in terms of delivery. It's important that obviously that we work in partnership with our local authorities. We at Living Plus tend not to develop with a view to developing something and customers will present themselves. We will only work where we know we have support from commissioners, where we know there is local demand and we know we're developing the right size and type of accommodation. I was really delighted to hear and to see what Julie and her colleagues at Central Beds have created. I wish everybody was in the same space as you, Julie. I'm not sure they are. The idea of understanding people's propensity to move, I think is one that would help us enormously. So in partnership, as I've said, with our internal compliance colleagues, with our external developer partner, we are working with architects with tried and tested design principles. So I've said that increasingly we're reducing communal space, but more importantly, we're looking at how our internal spaces can be flexible and adaptable to meet changing needs. So for example, we're commonly reducing the size of laundries because people want washing machines in their own apartments. Julie spoke about her priority would be not to share bathrooms. Absolutely, we're reducing assisted bathrooms because they're simply not used. We know that people want a flexible approach to dining. They don't necessarily want to eat in a communal dining area 7 days a week, but they do want to feel that when they want to come together with neighbours, they absolutely can do that. And increasingly, we're trying to ensure that the spaces we develop, whilst making designs as individual and as attractive as we can be, we're trying to ensure that we do everything really within the footprint, internally within the footprint of an apartment, so that we achieve true flexibility in terms of future proofing. Next slide, please. So with all those opportunities, and there are many of them, not least of all the increasing demand, as everybody has spoken about before, there are barriers. And we've the three previous speakers have spoken a lot about investment. There is a huge amount of institutional investment, particularly, that is interested in the space of particularly specialist supported housing in any shape or form, but definitely in housing for retirement housing. And that's about clearly it being very, very obviously a growth area, but also looking to the American, Canadian, New Zealand and Australian markets where there is a much greater propensity for people to make this move. But there are issues within both using external capital, but even for an organisation like Places for People using our own capital, the cost of delivery of anything that is slightly different from standardised mainstream housing is high. The relationships that we develop, particularly around an affordable rented model with external partners, can vary enormously from local authority to local authority. Typically, for us to make a new development work, we are dependent on the speed with which we can take it from practical completion to fully operational. So it's important to us. Clearly, we move people in safely, but it's important for us to be able to fill a new extra care scheme, particularly in a reasonable time. It's important for us to be able to agree rent and service charges that mean that the service remains affordable for us, but also clearly affordable for the customers. There is in terms of intergenerational, because it's a relatively new product, there are issues potentially around the sustainability of the mix of the community. And also, I think there needs to be greater incentives at a local level for us to develop. And some of that is absolutely about planning incentives. Jeremy, the examples you showed at the end of your presentation around some of the European schemes, I think would present quite a challenge to some of the local planners we work with, for example. Land availability obviously is a massive issue for everybody in a relatively small island. We're in competition for town-centred, right-sized plots, and I think we very quickly came to the realisation within Places for People that we were in competition with the likes of Lidl and Aldi, and they have much deeper pockets than we have. We're also up against a number of councils requiring capital receipts for land, which in an extra care model can be a real challenge. It can definitely be a challenge for a registered provider, where we're obviously required to demonstrate value for money. That high cost of land can obviously present a real problem for us. I think it was Neil who spoke at the front end around use classification. And I think that's something Julie spoke very positively about engagement with planning teams. I think as a provider, that would be great for us to see that as a more common theme amongst partners. In terms of intergenerational development specifically, I think, as I've just said, it's a nascent product. It's something that there isn't necessarily a culture of people in the UK understanding outside that family unit. So the question of what's in this for me, I think for both groups, in terms of older and younger people, the benefits of that, of the reduction in isolation and the healthcare benefits will increasingly have to be pointed out to people. There has to be some incentive to groups of people wanting to live differently from the way they lived previously. Now, arguably, that for younger people may well be just in accessibility to affordable accommodation, and that might come in terms of reduced rent, for example. In terms of affordable rented extra care schemes generally, the benefit regime is complicated. I think everybody that's had any experience of working within rent standards understand it's complicated when you are trying to work with different customer types at a single address. Arguably, that's resolved by individual apartments having individual addresses, but sometimes that's a difficult and complicated conversation to have with local housing benefit teams. The reality of housing benefit teams' approach to supported housing generally is inconsistent. It isn't always as well informed. People are not always as well informed as you would want them to be. And finally, in terms of the benefits, the tension between housing support, housing provision, care provision, the responsibility for well-being costs. Increasingly, we're looking at overnight presence being funded through well-being charges, and whose responsibility it is to manage and administer those charges can cause some tension in extra care schemes. So just in terms of talking about a recent case study, we're working alongside our delivery partner, Lovells Later Living, who Paula will follow this presentation, to develop 3 new schemes with Hampshire in Romsey, Gosport and New Milton. Unlike Central Bedfordshire, these are 2-tier authorities, as you will see. So we are working with the county council in terms of the demand for care and support, and the district councils, obviously, in terms of the housing needs. So immediately we have 2 partners to deal with, although obviously Hampshire are overarching across the three sites. But in terms of our negotiation for specific sites and specific conversations around benefits, the benefit regime and rents and service charges, that happens across the 3 districts. The developer worked with us in terms of the selection by tender of the build contractor. We worked very closely on some of the design details. The sites, each one of them had challenges in terms of their location and site specifics. The developments have all been funded by a combination of grants in terms of Homes England, county, local councils, and some of our recycle grant funding, but a significant amount of capital funding in there that came from us as well. We obviously will be the landlord and operator of the service. And we've worked very closely here with the council on space planning, community engagement, rents and service charges, the tender that supported the on-site care provider as well. Next slide, please. So, as I've said, the communal facilities design was agreed in collaboration. Now, that has presented some challenges throughout the process, because we've had different people with very different opinions. We've had input at a late stage by people who have a particular interest in accessibility and have their own very specific ideas around customers' need and future demand and so on and so forth. And as anybody who's been involved with development will understand, any late changes bring with them some significant increases in cost. We've been able to ensure that our social alarm specification in these developments has been flexed to allow the council's telecare contract to apply additional add-ons, which has been great in terms of cost to the customer. It's meant we've been able to keep the cost to the customer as low as possible. And importantly here, we had very early community engagement with the key influencers, and I think Julie referenced that as well. Local schools, colleges, health forum and older people's partnerships. I would say that requires quite a lot of work on behalf of the developer through the build stage and the housing provider. So those things don't necessarily automatically happen. And here in Hampshire, just the final point, we've agreed a 3 development-wide nominations approach. And final slide, please. So, as I've said, and I think has been a theme throughout today so far, we know that presentation and design can make a real difference to the quality of our customers' lives, and therefore our approach is that wherever possible, achievable, appropriate, we build in accessibility, as much digital inclusion as we can currently, and ensuring it is future-proofing where we can. We ensure that things are as economic and energy efficient as they're able to be, that they're cost effective, they're flexible, they're safe, they're homely, they're community based, they're what people want, and they're as innovative as they possibly can be within an affordable envelope. And on that note, I'll hand over to Paula. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Libby. I'm conscious that we're possibly running a little bit out of time, and I'm sure everybody wants to get on to the question and answer today. If you can take me on to the first slide, please. So there is various slides within the deck that we'll be picking up on a number of things, as you'll appreciate, that possibly people have covered in great detail today. So apologies if you think I'm going to race through the first couple of slides, but I'm really keen to basically share with you some of the experiences on the more later slides. For those of you who don't know me, my background has been very much from the public sector, now moving into the private sector. So over 30 years working for various housing associations, leading the specialist housing programme and extra care in North Yorkshire County Council for a period of time, working very closely with Neil, who was my boss for a period of time. And then moving on to Keepmoat, launching the lifestyle by NJ at NJ, following their acquisition, before landing here, and I'm managing director now at Lovell Later Living, as Libby says, working with Libby. So talking about the challenges that we very much face in relation to demographic and housing in particular, and creating place. I think the key message for me that I'd like to think, looking as we work through the slides, is around putting well-being at the heart of planning. And it is planning in the broadest spectrum. It isn't just planning as a local planning authority. It's very much about planning in relation to budgets, policies, investment, and across the whole spectrum. And thinking very much about the barriers, and what I'm going to do today is sort of focus on some of those barriers that actually prevent us creating some great places for people. And ultimately, I will share with you an example today of how intergenerational communities can be delivered through public-private partnership. Next slide, please. So I think just want to raise a bit of a point back to Julie here today. What was brilliant to really sort of hear Julie talk about in great detail was around, you know, do you understand the local demographic? Because as a developer, you know, this is a real sort of key question that we would like to think every local authority knows, but we often know that, you know, some, in a sense, understand their local demographic more than some others, and there can be a whole host of reasons why that is. But I mean, it is vital if what we're going to do is actually, you know, create intergenerational places, then we do need to look at the whole market. So I do thank Julie for making reference to that and thinking about that whole market. And it isn't just about those people who are requiring affordable housing solution or some financial support in relation to care and support. To really grasp what intergenerational is, we've got to think about all walks of life, all ages, and all needs. And so again, that investor prospectus, you know, is I would say is a great example of what we should be looking at. But the other challenge here is around, do you have the right partnerships with the developers, you know, to create those intergenerational places? You know, we know that there are various models out there. There's some fixed models, but, you know, bringing partners together who can collaborate, and, you know, even if they are wedded to only delivering one particular product or one particular housing model or tenure, but through partnerships, that collaboration can still create that intergenerational offer. So I think that's a thought again. I just want to set the scene here. Next slide, please. So the later living demographic, you know, I'm not going to go into the detail of the numbers because ultimately we've heard a lot about, you know, the numbers today. But I just want to basically just provoke the thought about, you know, where are all these older people living now? You know, and predominantly it is in a place like this, because unless we change the status quo, we're going to continue absolutely, you know, driving housing because we've got a housing crisis. But if we don't focus on, is that housing appropriate for old age, then we'll always get what we've always got, which is a really challenging, you know, housing position at the moment, where, you know, Neil made lots of points and gave lots of evidence there about how our homes are just not fit for old age, and how they're not accessible for people who are in need of accessible accommodation. And surely that can't be right. And so I think, you know, the thing that we really need to focus on here is, yes, the numbers are there, the demographic is there, but how do we change the status quo? Next slide, please. So as a developer, the demographic provides drivers to definitely to my business. You know, so when I was offered the position here at Lovell Partnerships to take over later living business, those of you that do know me can appreciate how excited I actually was to be able to be taking the seat in a business where we could actually, you know, influence change. We could look at later living as a whole, right across the spectrum, you know, from somebody's own home in sort of the early years of later life, where they're possibly still working, you know, they possibly still may, even some of them, have older children still living at home who haven't managed to get on the housing ladder yet, right through to people who are moving because they're in crisis, through to the specialist housing such as extra care. And yes, I agree with Julie, and it is that there is definitely still a need from the point of view of a specialist care home provision for those really acute needs, to prevent people from, you know, unfortunately ended up in a hospital institutional situation. You know, but the stark reality is that, you know, the other key driver here for the demographics is about intergenerational, because the fact is, and I've just pulled a couple of extracts here out of the slide of the percentage increase of the age groups between the 50 and the 64, and also that younger age group in the 30s, which is typically our working age. And as you can see, you know, there is a comparable here that we cannot ignore. If we're going to have the future workforce that can provide the services decentralized in local communities, then ultimately we've got to create communities where those people live and they can work locally on the doorstep. So it's just another dynamic that we need to think about when we're shaping and creating place, and when we're reviewing the local demographics and putting together the next local plan. Next slide, please. So from a later living market context, again, I'm not going to go into the detailed statistics, but they're here and they're clear to see. And the big speak is often around the 65 plus, but we often forget that, you know, the younger old age, and let's face it, from a planning authority point of view, we put a label on accommodation that's age restricted as 55 plus. You know, so we need to think about the bigger data and the bigger numbers, you know, because ultimately the over 55s homeowners unlocked 1.1 billion of property wealth in total in Q2 in 2021. And so that's big numbers. That's housing where people ultimately have got their capital invested, and in some instances are often tied into that. Everything they've got is tied into that property. And so to live well in future years, to prevent the need for institutional interventions from health and social care, those individuals need to be given a choice that's going to inspire them to release that property wealth by investing in a lifelong home, investing in somewhere to live and within an environment that's actually going to keep them well for longer. And at the same time, releasing capital, not just to provide themselves with any support that they do need, but actually to spend on the lifestyle that they want to have and obviously they deserve. And in return, freeing up that family home, which again, Julie referred to, and you know, Bedfordshire has captured that. And I think we need to do more about how can we work with, you know, each local authority to look at what property wealth is there, and what do we need to provide to those customers to in a sense entice them to release that. So I think that the bottom line is that, you know, we have a responsibility that we need to create products and we need to create communities that are aspirational, not from the point of view of just purely needs based at that point in time. And I think there's a message here from the population themselves, where when surveyed, there was 4 in 10 people that were actually crying out for the government to do more. So we need to get that message up as well, so that we're affecting future policies around, you know, the last time buyer as much as that first time buyer. Next slide, please. So there are opportunities as much as there are barriers for developers as well. So, you know, we talked an awful lot about the demographic data. So I think, you know, ultimately that's a no-brainer. The market is there, and the market is there for the developments across all sectors, including those people who are living, you know, with some wealth. But ultimately, you know, there are also a number of barriers that, in a sense, pose challenges which, you know, developers have to consider carefully. So when we hear the terms around, you know, for example, I think again it was Julia that referred to, you know, what customers really wanted was bigger bungalows on a smaller plot, but they can't build it. Well, there's a couple of things to sort of take into account there. That from the point of view of the bungalow, is from a mainstream housing developer, then that's land hungry. And where, you know, there is huge competition for land at present, and the challenges in securing that can often be quite diverse in relation to how it impacts on their ability to deliver actually what it is that people need. But the other side of this is that there is a planning side of it. So when we're talking about, you know, a large footprint property on a smaller plot, then we need to make sure that planners have been taken with us along the way. Because ultimately, you know, we've got distances between properties, and we need to really maybe think about how a policy needs to be changed locally to drive what you're actually wanting for the customer. So land availability is absolutely a challenge at this moment in time. So again, it's where looking at this collaboratively and working alongside a local authority's local plan hopefully gives you the way to actually secure the land. In relation to the partnership and the procurement side of it, when we're talking about the specialist elements within a development, then there is often a barrier if we don't have the same, you know, in a sense, drivers and sort of priorities that are put within the policies and around procurement of how ultimately the local authority can achieve what it wants to achieve without its hands being tied. Next slide, please. So what does good look like? I mean, ultimately, I would suggest from my experience, and that's what I'm sharing with you today, is that, you know, it is obvious that, you know, when it comes to actually really creating places, I would say local authorities need experts, resource investment and long-term commitment. And that isn't the case that every local authority has the benefit of being able to have that within their own organisation. So what's critical is that they align themselves with organisations that can provide that can collaborate and can form those partnerships. And ultimately, it's about promoting that healthier lifestyle and looking at it from the whole spectrum of low carbon emissions and that whole community well-being, because it is about creating the whole environment and not just about creating the home. But thinking about homes that are very easy to maintain and adapt in the future. So this again comes back to addressing that status quo. We've got to think really hard about what we're designing and how we are building it, to make sure that as somebody's life changes along the line, that home can change with them. And that's absolutely vital. And meeting those aspirations means we have to listen to customers. Next slide, please. So understanding your partner. And that's around having empathy for each other. So it's as much as having empathy for the customer as it is as having empathy for each other as partners. And to do that, you've really got to be able to see through their eyes and listen through their ears and actually feel what it feels like to be in their shoes. And that sometimes is quite difficult, but it is definitely worth the investment. You know, there's some key quotes here. There's another quote there if you want to click that again. that actually, talk about, the really great things that can be achieved, such as, could a greater miracle take place than for us to look through each other's eyes for an instant? And that was one thing for me that, really sort of steered me through my career and in wanting to achieve, some great things for the customers that we serve. Next slide, please. So the opportunity, and I've put an example in here to share with you today. We've got a couple of minutes left, so hopefully I've got time to actually share the detail. Can you next slide, please? So I'll take you back in a number of years. This is when I was at North Yorkshire County Council, but the Scarborough Borough Council public-private partnership that the Borough Council had with Kebble Homes dates back to pre my date at the County Council. I was still with RPs then in 1999, and they devised a local investment plan. It was two separate agricultural pieces of land, i.e. farmland. One was definitely a working farm. One was starting to in a sense break that activity down. But the two forces joined together, and what they wanted to do was basically bring investment to join onto an existing housing estate called Eastfield that was listed at that time in the top 10 most deprived in England. So there was high crime rates, high unemployment, high deprivation, and ultimately this was a master plan that was about regenerating that community. There was a very active ward councillors that were engaged in looking at that community with the community and building what the dream was, which was a place for everyone. And that was a very clear statement that was in there. But inevitably what happened over the years is that there was tensions that gained between them, because the timescales for the master plan, achieving viability, and in particular achieving planning, was huge. I became a consultee from the County Council when I arrived there and got to know both partners very, very well. And what became very clear to me is that they weren't talking each other's language. Kebble are a great organisation, and Nick Kebble, who runs it, is a great guy, but he's a house builder. And therefore, he shared the vision with the local authority, but it was impatient because it was, well, let's just get on and do it. From the Borough Council's point of view, the Borough Council was tied up in all sorts of, political and policy situations that were forever moving. And so therefore, they were just causing a frustration to Kebble, but ultimately ran out of money. So what we really did was looked at from the point of view of how could we make this work. Next slide, please. During this period of time, is when I actually left the County Council and moved to Keepmoat Regeneration. I maintained the relationships with both the Borough Council and with Kebble, and we had a number of discussions around how we could assist to make this work. And it was quite creative in what we did. So ultimately, the Borough Council was ready to stop because ultimately it had invested a considerable amount of money and had no more money to invest. But the master plan was set to deliver 1,350 new homes. Extra care housing was the first development to go on the site to replace the County Council's elderly persons care home. There was supported housing for learning disabilities and vulnerable people, a new infant school going on there, the Central Boulevard, and a highways network that would join two communities together in a major A road across a bridge. And we achieved this by the Borough Council and Kebble accepting, in a sense, a proposal that I put to them for us to become part of this partnership. And to do this, Kebble and Keepmoat formed a limited liability partnership, regeneration partnership, which then enabled the Borough Council to novate their initial strategic partnership agreement with Kebble over to this LLP. What we did then was we brought investment to this partnership, and we secured the outline consent. Next slide, please. It gained traction over a period of time. We can jump past this. I've talked you through this, but we can jump to the next slide. And the point is that we also engaged very heavily the Housing Corporation at the time, now Homes England, and looked at the whole infrastructure and how investment could be brought in to enable the developers to move this along. And this just gives you a visual of the location of these two pieces of farmland, with the central bit is where the bridge was going to go across to a join. Next slide, please. So Middle Deepdale today, this is an aerial shot, and this gives you a picture of, you'll see in the bottom of the right hand side image where there's existing properties of Eastfield, with the adjoining road through to where the extra care and the school is already built and has been now operating for a number of years. Family housing and supported housing that's surrounding it. And then the superimposed image to the side is showing you where now in my new capacity, we're acquiring land on this site, and we're going to be bringing our first later living open market sale, which are properties designed to a lifelong standard, focusing on listening to the customer. What does the customer want? Bringing them choice of property type between bungalows, between walk-up cottage apartments, between two-storey dormer bungalows, but really thinking about a community within a community and integrating those communities so that you've in a sense created this place which is purely intergenerational. Next slide, please. So ultimately, I'll leave you with my final slide today, and apologies, we are a couple of minutes running over. But what I would say is it is all possible, but it's only possible through collaboration and through the public and private sectors actually working actively together to create places that meet all demographics and all need. I think the thing from my point of view and what we bring as later living business is complemented by what we bring as a wider business across Lover Partnerships and the Morgan Sindall Group. And I think the more that we can resemble that sort of approach, I would say for the better, and you would say I would because I'm biased because this is where I sit and it's my business, but I'm speaking through experience and sharing with you some of that experience, which I'd love to do at another point in time, possibly in the question and answers, in more detail of whether some of them's pitfalls, because I appreciate I've raced through that presentation. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Paula. And thank you to all of our other speakers as well from this first half of the session today. I'm going to invite some of our speakers to answer some of the questions that were posted in the chat. I know all of them did a sterling job of answering quite a lot of them that came through the chat at the time. We've got until about 1:15 because I'm conscious that I want to give people a lunch break before the afternoon session begins. So with that in mind, we've got about 10 minutes or so. I'll try and race through as quick as I can so that I give the speakers opportunity to go into detail. So just looking through the chat, I'm going to pick out some of the questions which I don't think were responded to in enormous detail before. The first question I would like to approach towards Neil and possibly Jeremy as well. And that question is, what are your hopes for greater collaboration between the NHS, housing and local authorities? So over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Rory. I think the simple answer is I am much more confident than I've probably been for some time. And as I said in my presentation, the stars seem to be aligning, if you like, whether that be planning policy, whether that be social care policy through the white paper, the guidance to ICSs, etc. So I'm probably more confident than I've been for a long time, but I'm ever the optimist, and I've been confident before. But I think currently it is more lining up, and certainly I'd welcome sort of Julie's and Jeremy's sort of reflections on that as well.
Shall I just quickly come in before Julie? I think you're right. I think that they are aligning. I think we probably need some firmer statutory guidance, and I think the social care white paper and the integration paper hopefully will also create that, because I think what Neil shared earlier was that there are systems in place. What we haven't described is in some localities we also have memorandum of understanding between health, housing and social care. And in fact, Homes England are a signatory to the national memorandum of understanding as well. And what would be really great is how we can use that and the adaptive practice to help build some of those relationships, not nationally, but locally, because that's where it really matters to create those binding relationships.
I think, Rory, I would just say that actually, if you look at the integrated care systems, their whole focus is about place and subsidiarity. And place is something that councils understand, isn't it? And where we see ourselves as leading. So I think there's a great opportunity to work more closely together. And it's interesting because we're starting from a very different place in terms of what we understand in terms of the opportunities of housing. And conversations with health colleagues have been around key workers. Well, there's much more, sorry, there's much more to it than that. And planning for healthy lives and healthy communities, we need to bring together public health along with our health partners as well. But see the opportunities, it's not just about housing and where people live, but it's about the sorts of services that they've got access to as well. And sort of pushing on the digital agenda, in a context of being short of GPs and other primary care colleagues, I think there's a lot that we can do together to use the facilities that we've got across councils, housing, the health system, so that we make a much better local offer for people. So like Neil, I'm actually optimistic about this development.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, all three of you. I'm just looking through some more questions. There was one directed towards Jeremy, but I might actually try and open this up because I think quite a few of you may have an opinion on this. And the question that came through said, most of the schemes Jeremy shared were based in the south. Is there a lag in the quality of design and types of accommodation between the north and the south? So I'm happy to open this up if anyone wants to jump in here and give their point of view.
Well, I must say I quickly corrected myself in the chat, Rory, and I did post a number of examples that cover the northeast and northwest. And in fact, if anything, I would say that there are some real significant schemes coming through from the northwest and northeast in particular, especially if you follow some of the work that's been happening across the Greater Manchester councils, for example.
Fantastic, brilliant. Thank you for that, Jeremy. There was a question which I think Paula touched on in a little bit of detail in one of the questions that came through in the chat, but I was kind of inviting her to expand on it a little bit. And that question said, are there any examples of any specialist housing schemes granted in the green belt on non-previously developed sites? So Paul, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more on what you touched on before.
Yeah, happy to do so. I think it's there's the example that I put in the chat is the lifestyle behind you one at Walton, and I was focusing this on a specialist scheme in the nature of it. It is open market sale. It's not extra care housing. I think Neil posted a lot of examples of North Yorkshire's programme where we did a number of things up in the national parks, and he puts a couple of examples there for SMOs, etc. So the one that I put on for Walton was unique in a sense because it was a designated site for open space. It was green, never been developed before, small rural, semi-rural village to say, which a developer had been trying to get planning consent for a number of years. But the discussion with the local authority was very much around, although absolutely agreed it shouldn't be granted consent for a general needs housing development, that would they not consider it as a specialist housing development, which was age restricted and that was focused on promoting well-being for people. So it took some negotiation, but we did get there. The way that the planning authority had to grant consent, however, and this was the irony of it, was under the policy restrictions that they had to grant consent as a CCRC. And typically, if you looked at the planning class for a CCRC, a continuing care retirement community, it should have actually had a care home on site because that's what made it fall into the bracket. But, I discussed it at length with them that, because we'd taken the design of the development as a whole and the properties and included a community hub that provided people access to that care and support, why should it be dictated to by having a care home on site? Just the same as, if there was Section 106 negotiations as well, we got tied up in a little bit of knots because obviously from the local authority point of view, they were wanting to restrict it to people that needed care and that care should be available to them. The issue that I had with it is that, again, screamed against the whole personalisation agenda, that people should have a choice to who provides them care. So providing access is one thing, but dictating who provides it is another. So to me, it was just a really great example that the local authority really embraced it. They got behind it. It was, they really had to work outside of what policy limits were at the time. And so ultimately, it's gone on. It's been a great success. It's 129 properties. There's 7 different house types on there. It's going on now to further land, again, further greenfield land that was allocated as a wildflower meadow. example, and they've granted consent because the demand has just been so great. And the community hub is really embraced and used by the people who live there. And you've got a real mixture of people who have moved in what you would class as early later life because they're preparing. You know, they know that ultimately they're living with some conditions where their environment is important to them. And we've seen an awful lot of that come out of COVID. You know, the sales post-COVID have absolutely increased 2- and 3-fold because people are really conscious about where they're living. But the benefit of it is they've moved into a development that will support them through later years, no matter what life throws at them. And they can use the community hub to, you know, interact with each other and the wider community, because the hub is right on the doorstep of the entrance to the site. So it's connecting the two communities. So again, it's another example of that intergenerational by default, because you've connected the family housing that's already there with the new specialist housing that's on site.
Fantastic. That was really insightful. Thank you very much for that, Paula. It's 1:15 now. Conscious that I really want people to get a proper lunchtime, and we've got until 2 p.m. So a 45-minute lunch break. That's all we've got time for this first half of the session. I hope you've all found it incredibly useful. I've certainly found it incredibly insightful. And we'll be reconvening at 2 o'clock to kick off this afternoon's second half of the session. So see you all shortly. Welcome back to everyone for this afternoon session. Hope you had a nice break. I will pass over to Adrian and Milena to kickstart this afternoon session.
Thank you, Rory. Can everybody hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up, Rory? I changed my mic setting. Thank you to Homes England for inviting us to speak today. We're really pleased to be here and to be involved with the Winter Learning Programme today. We are Hill Patru Architects, formerly Adrian Hill Architects. I'm Adrian Hill. Milena Patru is here also. We set up a practice in the summer of 2020. We're now a team of 4. So in previous practices, Milena and I have both been involved with care home design, student housing, and affordable housing. And one of the first things we did together as a new practice was to work on an intergenerational housing competition. This was run at the end of 2020 by Enfield Council and Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing. And we saw it, entering the competition, we saw it as an opportunity to bring together our experiences in all those different sectors that we'd been working on in practice. So we were successful with the competition, and that subject of intergenerational living has remained a point of focus for us as a practice. We know that intergenerational living is a solution for an ageing population. There is growing evidence as well that ad hoc intergeneration in the UK is on the rise. And there's definitely a need for innovative and alternative housing models to address this. So we've developed that initial competition idea into a design concept for specialised intergenerational living. And we call this concept 2 front doors. So first slide, please. So the concept brings intergenerational living principles into the very configuration of the accommodation. And we do this by introducing what we call a linked unit. And the design draws from personal and professional experience and also acknowledges the benefits and challenges that are posed by intergenerational living. It puts forward innovative solutions for sharing space without compromising privacy, and also allows flexibility at unit scale, creating spaces for communities, we think, to thrive. So at the moment, we are at a point where we're doing further research into the community appetite for this, as well as seeking funding to progress our model to a pilot scheme. We've developed the linked unit concept in various accommodation sizes and layouts that meet the GLA's affordable housing programme funding criteria, and developed configurations in which these linked units come together as versatile blocks with varied community spaces. And also we've developed ideas for how the living benefits of skill sharing and intergenerational learning, so cross-generation learning can be supported, because that's very important in tackling loneliness, and can also bridge the gap between generations. Next slide, please.
Intergenerational housing is not a new concept. It's just something that modern practices in modern housing, societal norms and policy has moved away from. But with a growing elderly population and a worsening housing crisis, it is something that should be brought to the fore, as it has been proven to provide viable solutions. So the next slide, please. In Enfield, where we are based, 22% of the 120,000 homes are categorized as other household, and of these, most are intergenerational homes. A large percentage of these are overcrowded, 53% of the socially rented ones and 47% of the private homes. Furthermore, this tendency is on the increase. Approximate figures by the CBRE estimate that around 1.8 million households now span two or more adult generations, and that's up 38% since 2009. Factors driving this are increased cost of living, lack of accommodation for the elderly, high cost of childcare, and millennials' difficulty in accessing the property market. CBRE also estimates that in the UK, around 125,000 homes are converted or adapted to support multi-generational living every year, rather than purpose-built homes being provided. Next slide, please. This trend is not yet sufficiently addressed by both private and social housing developments, where design is typically geared to only accommodate specific groups, the nuclear family, the young professional, the elderly, resulting in a generational separation. And there have been recently there have been proposals that incorporate intergenerational elements, but few offer an integrated and specialized approach. Our proposal, developed around the linked unit's intergenerational exchange potential, will fill in this gap. When successful, intergenerational living can provide a great housing alternative for the aging population by enabling people at all stages in life to support each other in a mutually beneficial way. It also has its challenges, such as balancing the need for privacy and the advantages of living together, the need for flexibility to accommodate life changes, and creating spaces to support a vibrant community life. And our concept takes cues from traditional intergenerational models in order to address these challenges in a contemporary urban high-density setting. And there are examples of intergenerational housing models all over the world and throughout history. Here in the UK, one example is the courthouses in the West Midlands, Birmingham in particular, where working class families, young and old, shared courtyards, toilets, laundry areas. Privacy was something that only the wealthy could afford, and conditions were quite bad here. Next slide, please. But the shared nature of the space does offer something that modern policy and modern private development struggle with, and that's that everyone knew the neighbours and everyone helped each other out. If we could have the next slide, please, and then the next one. We were also inspired by traditional multi-generational living in Transylvanian villages and noted its mark on the built environment, because typically here the houses come in pairs, a larger one and a smaller one, and they share an enclosed courtyard, barn and stables, but they have separate entries. So the social norm was for the youngest child to inherit a farmstead, and when they got married, the elderly parents moved into the smaller house to make room for the new family. Next slide, please. At other stages of the family's life, the small house could be occupied by adult children just before they left the nest. And this allows a degree of movement to respond to different needs throughout time. The two houses are linked by the space they use in common, but they also maintain their autonomy towards the public realm, which are the two front doors. And the same really happens in the Birmingham example. So it is this principle that we sought to embed in our initial concept. Next slide, please. We were looking at these traditional living examples, and in trying to figure out a way of adapting the principles to a contemporary urban setting, we found there were three major challenges. And in this point in our presentation, we were very interested in finding out which of these seemed to you to be the biggest hurdle. So we'd be grateful if you could vote in the poll, which should be made available in the chat. And these three challenges that we found were balancing the need for privacy and the benefits of sharing space, and then creating appropriate, sustainable legal frameworks to enable the flexible space sharing. And then we thought there might be a cultural resistance to it.
Next slide, please. So we'll now talk about the actual detail of the concept that we call two front doors. And like the Transylvanian example that Milena showed, we've developed a plan which shows two typical apartments, a linked unit. If we could have the next slide, please. So what we have here is two flats, one smaller than the other, and the gold-coloured floor shows the space that they use in common. So that's the red room between the apartments and the terrace. So our vision is for these elements to be able to be shared if desired, and this is what we call the linked unit. So each apartment will have access from a different stair and a different lift core, but also a door leading into the shared space. But we know that during the lifespan of the building, the shared spaces do have the potential to be reallocated to one or the other of the apartments. So replacing the linked unit with two separate flats if necessary. So in kind of technical terms, that would mean wrapping the room in red with an external wall, a separating wall structure, and being able to move the boundary as necessary. Next slide, please. So this is our case study family. They have a linked unit at the estate that we're calling two front doors, and it works for them because they are elderly parents occupy the smaller unit and the family occupy the larger one. So they can be right next to the grandparents who are less able and the grandparents right next to the grandchildren. They have a shared room which they use as a snug, but it could be a bedroom, a study, whatever it needs to be. So in this scenario, the snug might act as a buffer between the two apartments, so privacy is maintained when they need it. But it can be opened up for celebrations when the grandparents need assistance, or when the family need the grandparents to say watch the kids for a few hours after school. Next slide, please. So we know that's kind of quite idyllic in concept, and the real innovation here would be the mechanisms in place to allow flexible boundaries during the life cycle of the estate, because life isn't straightforward. People move on and people pass on, and units would become vacant if that was so. The linked unit and the concept of shared living that was once ideal for our case study family could fall apart when one of the units becomes vacant. So flexibility in the plan also needs to be reflected in how the linked unit could be split and brought together over the years and life cycle of the estate. Next slide, please. Yeah, so for true intergenerational tenancy, a parent could work as two different families. So one way this could be done is by running a tenant interview process, which would include the adjacent family, finding out whether it would be a good match. So in this slide here, you can see an example of other ways in which the two units could be configured to be completely separate. The plan on the left shows the shared room occupied by a larger 4-bed flat. So it's not shared anymore, it's occupied by the larger 4-bed flat, but they still use the terrace as a shared space. And the plan on the right shows the blue unit, the smaller unit, occupying the room, and there is no shared space. So the plans here show units on the lower floors, and as you go up, these could get smaller, allowing two students to pair up with an elderly couple or a single parent. So how does it all come together? Next slide, please.
We aim for a density of 200 units per hectare on a hypothetical half-a-hectare rectangular site. And with the flat sizes that we've looked at, this is a 7 to 8 story development. We have tiered the apartments, and there are a number of successful examples of this all over London. Not only does this help with allowing sunlight to the inner parts of the development, but it also creates a degree of overlooking, which is something that we feel would benefit community living. Much like the courthouses of the West Midlands, the apartments are dual aspect. One one side of the flat faces the conventional street and the other side faces inwards to what we call the community Broadway. And this is the real hub of the estate and something that we feel enables further community interaction with access to workshops and performance spaces. Next slide, please. Okay.
Yeah,
The private, the share and the common. So this heading refers to a series of spaces which animate Broadway and provide further opportunity for intergenerational mixing and neighborly encounters. Because off the Broadway, not only might there be workshops and offices, but these are interspread with private and semi-private courtyards, much like our Transylvanian farmstead example. And the gold color here indicates shared semi-private spaces. Yeah, next slide, please.
So the gold colour again represents the community Broadway, the heart of the estate. As we mentioned in the previous slide, you'll find shops, community office, coffee shop perhaps, workshops, maybe a GP surgery and playgrounds, workshops. And the community office is something that would be an important aspect to the estate, something that would be run by the residents, and they would be responsible for the application and interview process of new residents. But they would also run performances, social clubs, skill sharing workshops. It would also manage a community task force, which might be a list of residents who are able to help out either by way of maintenance, staffing the community shop, running errands, doing the post, that sort of thing, provided for the residents by the residents. And this is something that could offset a maintenance charge or offset a portion of the rent of these individuals. And we know of a few examples both in this country and worldwide, where things have been written into tenancy agreements about sharing time with others. So you must do 6 hours worth of this per week or something, and that's something that is written into the tenancy agreement. So it's a carpenter may mentor youngsters on site, but also be a member of the community task force.
We looked at how the units and their sizings fit within the GLA affordable housing program and the London Plan Space Standards. And we developed layouts that are dimensioned so as to achieve a balance between the flexibility and adaptability potential and the built-in space contingency. And in order to do so, the unit's GIA come as close as possible to the minimum GIAs in a maximum occupancy scenario. So that's where the shared room is actually used as a double bedroom by one or the other of the apartments. But the intergenerational living potential is best achieved in a less intensive occupation scenario where the extra room and the extra space accounts for intergenerational exchange opportunity. And scalability is achieved through variations in building height, while the generic concept suggests linear repetition of mirrored building blocks to achieve a high density. This strategy can be adapted to fit the site and the urban context.
So to wrap up then, intergenerational living is not the right choice for everyone, but there is a growing demand for this living arrangement. Ultimately, the aim of our project is to make it an affordable housing option for an ageing population. At this stage of the, so our concept borrows spatial principles that facilitate intergenerational living in successful low density settings and adapts these to high density urban developments, and opening up the potential for developers and councils to include intergenerational living in their offer without compromising on development potential. And hopefully it will be available and affordable to culturally diverse urban communities that haven't had this choice before. So that's a little bit about our concept. I'd be interested to hear your questions on it, but I'm now going to hand over to Jenny.
Thank you, Adrian. And hopefully everybody can hear me as well. Can I have the first slide, please? Oh, sorry. Can you go back a slide? Right, sorry. Okay. I'll just tell you a little bit about me, first of all. Well, I'm a partner at PRP. I'm an architect, and we have at PRP, we have a dedicated team that work just on later living. And in that later living team, we're absolutely passionate about working and anything to do with older people's housings. And we do multi-generational homes, such as the ones that Adrian's and Milena have just been talking about, right through to the specialist housing schemes. We look at age-friendly housing in the middle of master plans, retirement communities, retirement villages, care homes. And I think most importantly for us, we're across tenures, all tenures. And in recent years, we have seen quite a big shift towards the private sector. And that's partly due to pressures on revenue funding, but actually it's also partly in response to the lack of available housing in the private sector, I would say. But I think the thing that's really exciting for our team is that we're seeing across the 10 years that developers are considering quite different approaches to older people's housing, and with that brings quite a divergence in models, and it brings real choice for residents. But specifically today, I have been asked to speak to you about regenerating town centres and how later living can be part of that solution. So this document that's come up on the screen is one that was produced by the government a few years ago now, and it was looking specifically at this issue about regenerating town centres. So I'm going to just reflect a little bit now on the challenges that are facing today's high street. And then I'm going to, in the second part of my presentation, will be considering later living as part of that town centre regeneration. And then in the third part of my presentation, I will show you a case study to demonstrate how this can potentially be achieved. So this document, as I say, it actually highlights some really, really interesting things about town centre regeneration. It's worth a read. And I think these 4 bits were the bits that I picked out of it. That talks about there being too much space in our town centres, and therefore we need to think about how we might be repurpose that. And I think as you start to see, a lot of the larger chain stores moving out of town centres, that issue of what we do with that space will become more and more pertinent. There is also an issue about fragmented ownership. So maybe years ago, a lot of local authorities owned quite large proportions of the high street. We're actually seeing some local authorities buying back parts of their high street so they can actually influence the future of those. And then those last 2 items I thought were quite key, because in the pandemic they've been quite an issue. Rents and rates, business rates on those retail units has absolutely crippled some of the retailers. But actually we're seeing the change in customers' habits, which will continue. We are going to see more online shopping. So we need to think again about what our town centres look like. Can I have the next slide, please? And there's lots in the press about what's the future of the high street, so we need to rethink them. And I love this one by City AM, which talks about restart, reboot, rethink, and the 3 Rs. And I do think it requires a lot of vision from clients and from local authorities and from planners to sort of think about what that might look like for their particular communities. But ultimately, I think the high street needs to go back to becoming a destination. It can't just be about shops. And it can't be about large chain stores. So we need to think about, what some of those shops might look like in the future. But actually, people are really looking for experiences. They want to leisure. They want pop-up markets, places to socialise, places to eat and drink. It's more about the shop, more than just shops. It's about boutique shops rather than the big chain stores. And I think that's what we're starting to see come through with the projects. Can I go to the next slide, please? And then reflecting on, again, town centres and how you can, regenerate those communities. One of the things is about getting people back and living in the town centres. So, that's not been the case for some years. We've seen a lot of people moving out of town centres, but I think to make them these vibrant places and to bring them back to being the heart of our communities, we need to see people living in them. Now, older people, I think, are the ideal, but I'm biased, I would say, are ideal to have them living in these communities because they've got so much to bring back to it. We talk about the longevity dividend. They've got time in their hands. They can be volunteers, they can be mentors, they've got experience, to bring to those communities. Childcare was one of the things that Adrian Milena just mentioned, but they actually are community builders. They have that time to give back to the community. But critically for them, they want to stay connected. They want to stay connected to their communities. And if you put them away from the town centres, then they're less able to access facilities as they age. And we want to allow them to age in place. So putting them right next to the town centre means they can access all the different facilities in a much, much easier way without having to get on buses and trains and the like. So move to the next slide, please. So going back to, Jeremy mentioned the happy recommendations earlier and the happy reports. And there are 2 key recommendations, I think, that are pertinent to town centre regeneration. One is about placing our specialist housing buildings as part of the wider neighbourhood, making them into the community hubs and looking at how we engage with the public realms. And these are 2 key things I'm going to look at in the case study. So with the current, you know, it's about, again, it's about really the public realm is quite key to making sure that these spaces will work into the future. Can I have the next slide, please? So my case study today is Station Road, West Byfleet. I would say that there have been a few schemes that we've looked at over the years that I built. With Jeremy mentioned earlier Arden Quarter for Orbit in Stratford, which is a really good one to look at. We've also got one on site at the minute with Barnett Homes on Broadway, and places for people with one that's completed last year in Hackbridge called Button House. So there are a number of these specialist housing schemes that are being built on high streets already. But I put this one in because this is actually quite a large scheme, and I think it actually shows how when a particular developer has got a certain vision for how they want that development to actually work into the future and how they look to control it. So this scheme is actually for Retirement Villages Group. It's got 179 apartments in it. And it's, I think it's a good blueprint for local authorities to think about. So they have a very strong vision about how they want this community to look for the future, and they will continue to control and operate that for the next 30, 60 years plus. And for them, they wanted to create aspirational living for older people at the heart of the community. So it's got 197 apartments that are for rent and sale for older people. It's got a range of facilities that are all open to the wider community. And they put placemaking at the heart of what they were doing. And what they really wanted to create was an age-friendly public areas and facilities that are open to all generations, and to really encourage the intergenerational relationship across the community. But for the design perspective, for this to be successful, there was three sort of key relationships that we needed to get right from the outside. And that was about the thresholds between what was public, what's considered semi-public or shared spaces for the residents, and then the private spaces for the residents. And that's what I'm going to look at in a little bit more detail, because each of those, if you get them right, they really help people's sense of well-being. We know that older people, or people as they age, you know, have concerns about security. So making sure those thresholds work properly for them is really, really key. Next slide, please. So this is describes RBG's vision for their retirement communities, and they want integrated communities. They want all generations in it, but they want to support people to stay active, healthy and sociable in their later years. The other thing that they want to do in West Byfleet is about promoting health and well-being across the development. And that's not just for the residents moving in, that's for the staff who will work in it, and that's for the public who come and use the facilities. We used Fitwell as a way of assessing this, and we've achieved a 3-star rating, and it will be not just in the design, it will continue right through to the operation, it will continue to be assessed. The other thing about creating sustainable communities, this is a whole life zero carbon, so it's net zero carbon in accordance with the UK GBC framework, and it's from design right through to operation. So that's quite a key thing, a key driver, and that's come from their funders. It's one of the real things that they wanted to push on the project. We also have BREEAM Excellent for all the retail units that we're having the scheme. And the thing that's really important about that for our residents is that the operational energy, their energy bills are predicted to be 50% better than new build that is being created today. Next slide, please. So this is a bit about the location. And so, you know, if you look at this, the site is so well located. It's right in the centre of West Byfleet. You can see to the right-hand side of the aerial view, you can to the east, there's a lovely recreation ground. There's a church there. You can see to the rear of the site, the railway station. You can see the railway line running, and the railway station is just to the rear of the site. And then to the western side of the site, there's the West Byfleet Medical Centre and a Waitrose. And then all around the site, the images you see at the bottom are some of the local shops, and it's a conservation area, and the shops are lovely little boutique shops that we wanted to knit into that for this. So next slide, please. I think consultation is really important in any project we do, and I have to say it was phenomenal on this scheme. The previous building that was on the site, which has now been demolished, is called Sheer House. If you search online, you'll see it, you'll get a flavour of the consultation in this. So consultation events took place every 2 weeks throughout the design, and we were able to, in fact, because it was the pandemic, and we actually weren't able to do them in person, but actually online meant that we were able to relay information quite quickly to the general public. When we went to planning, we had virtually no objections to the scheme, and so we got planning quite smoothly on the site. But I say that more than anything else, that actually gave the local community a sense of ownership of this. So they're already having people questioning, can they lease some of the retail units? And I think this will continue. The consultation is continuing on anyway, and it will do so right throughout the build period. But this means that people feel that they have that bit of ownership of this scheme even before they've opened their doors, which is fantastic. Next slide, please. So I mentioned placemaking was key to the design, and looking at that private, semi-public and public areas. And this has been actually also thought really through very thoroughly to make sure that we're sort of promoting interaction. And it's about allowing residents to choose how much they want to integrate with the shared community within the development, with the wider community. So what you see here is our site plan. You can see Station Approach that takes you to the left is off to the station, and Old Woking Road and Lavender Park Road. So it is quite an island site to a great extent, but the 01 in the centre of that plan shows the public square, which is the heart of our development for the wider community. And the the three areas that show 05 on it, they are first floor shared spaces, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. So can I have the next slide, please? So this is public square. So you can see here, the whole design is wrapped around this square. We've looked at it very thoroughly, considering range of activities throughout the year, but ultimately we want this to be a destination. It's a space where we want it to change during the course of the year, and we want people to want to visit it. Next slide, please. So we looked quite thoroughly at what does summertime look like and what does wintertime look like. So the image on the left-hand side is our public square summertime. You've got a central feature of water jets for kids to come and play in. The areas that are yellow or spill-out spaces from some of the retail units. And you've got a bank of trees to the south of that, so that you can actually have a bit of shading in the summertime. But it's actually creating that flexible space in the centre. So in the image on the right-hand side shows what might happen in winter time. So we could have an ice rink, we could have a Christmas tree there, we could have a Christmas market on it. So again, it's about having that sort of all year round sense of destination there, so with lots of activity going on. Next slide, please. And then thinking about how we integrate it into that wider community and what we can give back to the wider community. So there was a small library on the site originally, which has been temporarily moved elsewhere, and it will be re-provided on the most prominent corridor of Lavender Park Road and Old Woking Road, which is what you can see on the image on the left. And that little library will be taken over by the local authority, and it will just, again, by giving back to the public, it will be accessed off the public square. So the idea is in the summertime, kids might have story time outside in the square, and they can spill out into the square and make use of that space. Next slide, please. This shows the shops, the retail units we've put in. We've 11 retail units. They're not large chain stores. They're small retail shops, boutique shops. The client's thinking of things like artisan bakeries, cycle shops with cafes, maybe a specialist gin store. And they're talking to the local retailers through the consultation process, and we know that a few of them are interested in taking these spaces, but they basically wrap around into the public square. Next slide. Then we have our shared residence spaces. So it's really key for the client that the later living spaces, the shared amenities, are actually open to the wider public. The majority of them, not all of them, but the majority of them. So these are the ground floor ones, which are open to the wider public. We have a restaurant, which would have a cafe area as well, and that can spill out onto the public square. We've got a community lounge that can be used for different activities, and the community can come in and use that. And then we have our health and wellbeing, so that it's got a swimming pool, and it's got a little gym and an exercise room and a spa area. And it's all about promoting health and wellbeing for our residents and for the wider community as well. But you can see that on the image on the right-hand side, that shows the entrance into that space. There are separate residential entrances elsewhere for the residents that are living on site. Next slide. And as I mentioned, it's about that threshold between what's public and then what's semi-public. So separate to the public areas I've just described, this is at first floor level. So in between terrace 2 and 3, there are a series of communal rooms that are for the residents only, and the visitors obviously. And there are residents' lounge, we've got a art room, and we've got activity spaces and library spaces there. So they can spill out onto terrace 2 into terrace 3, and there's a connection then through to terrace 1, which overlooks the public square. Next slide, please. This is terrace 1 that overlooks the public square, and you can see that the visual connection with that public square is really important, but it actually acts almost as an extension of the square visually as well. But this one is aimed at, it's got a little greenhouse in the middle, it's got abundance of planting, it's got some raised planters where people can do gardening activities, etc. Next slide, please. This one is terrace 2, it's north facing, which is quite good because the art room leads off that, so potentially you could take your easels out on a warm sunny day and use this space, but it's a quiet, tranquil space. It's a different type of space to the other roof terraces. And in this one, it's all about quite subdued planting and just allowing space where people can actually spend a bit of time in a much more sort of calm and tranquil area. Next slide, please. Now this is the main terrace, and it provides a series of different spaces within it. You've got a barbecue area, which is number 5, number 4 there. You've got number 7, which is a lawned area for things like a bit of croquet and a bit of French bowls. And then you've got a feature tree in the centre of that with patio areas that lead out from the communal lounge spaces. So again, it's about those communal lounge spaces being able to spill out onto that terrace, and for that to be a much busier roof terrace in the warm summer months particularly. Next slide, please. But these spaces, going back to the public, semi-public and private spaces, it is really important that we provide some private amenity space for every flat. So each flat has got a really generous balcony. They're all over 5 square metres. Some cantilevered, some recessed to provide a bit of choice. But we know that home is where most older people, as they age, will spend most of their time. So their personal outdoor space is absolutely key to their well-being. And we've seen, particularly, this is an issue that's come up again and again, and from feedback during the pandemic, that people's actual outdoor space, their personal outdoor space, has been really key. So I think that we've got a good balance of these in West Byfleet. So next slide. So this is just fine to finish off now. This is the public square at night. Again, we looked at it not just across the seasons, but at different times of the day of what that might look like. And you can see in the distance, you can see the view of St John's Church, which just helps a bit with that orientation. And our later living entrance is on the left-hand side of that image. So again, making sure that our spaces are all open to the wider public and people are really encouraged to come and use them. So I would say in conclusion, for me, town centres need to be destinations where, where people want to go and where they want to spend time. We have to go back to making them the hubs of our community. And I think putting later living in the town centres is a fantastic way to do that. It keeps older people at the heart of the community that they've probably lived in all their life. And it actually really contributes to their well-being, but it actually can be part of contribute to the well-being of the whole community as altogether. So that's me. Thank you. Last slide. I'm going to hand over now to Irene.
Hi everybody, my name's Irene Craik. I'm a director at Levitt Bernstein, and with me I'm doing a double act with Zoe Watson, who's our sustainability specialist at the practice. Just a few words about who we are if you don't know us. We're a practice of around about 125 people, split between a main office in London and a smaller studio up in Manchester. And we're a practice of architects, but also importantly urban designers, landscape architects and interior designers. So we've got a sort of a holistic way of designing not just the buildings, but also really importantly the spaces between them as well, which is so important, as Jenny was also talking about in terms of older people's housing in particular. So we've been asked to talk about later living design in the context of net zero and the climate emergency that we're all facing. Obviously a lot of The audience, I'm sure, are considering how you're going to tackle this in terms of your own housing stock, both existing and new build. But we're going to look at it through the lens of later living specifically, and in one project that we've been developing with Phoenix Community Housing, who are a small housing association down in the south of London in Lewisham, for our scheme called Melfield Gardens. So Zoe's going to kick off with a bit of broad principles around our sort of route map to how we're getting to net zero, and then we'll talk through the scheme in a bit more detail. So over to you, Zoe, in the next slide, please.
Thanks, Irene. So as Irene already said, I'm just going to set the context of where we're at as the industry. You should all know we are on a pathway towards net zero. We have just had COP26, and the UK has a legal requirement to reach net zero by 2050. However, at Levitt Bernstein, we believe that you should get it right first time round rather than retrofitting in future. So this pathway developed by Letty, which you may be familiar with as an organisation of built environment professionals who volunteered to create a roadmap towards achieving net zero, and we regularly participate as part of Letty to contribute to their guidance for new build and retrofit. So this pathway just shows that if we really want to meet our climate emergency targets, we actually have to ramp up our targets sooner and not leave it to the last minute. So 2030 we see as the real target for new build as 100% of the buildings achieving net zero. So each year we'll have to increase the percentage of net zero buildings. So we go to the next slide, please. And net zero is used as a term a lot, but just to be clear, what we mean by that is essentially balancing the amount of energy that a building uses. So we need to make sure our buildings are extremely efficient in the first place, and I'll explain how you achieve that. And also then producing enough renewable energy on the grid to actually create this sort of balance of the amount of energy that buildings use in the UK and the amount of energy produced. So at the minute, you can see on the right-hand side at a national scale, we're tipping that balance because we're using way too much energy and we're not producing enough. And actually levelling the books is a really important move, and also really helpful because it means if we use less energy, it's actually lower energy bills, and it's better for as a UK to achieve that. So we go to the next slide. So we have 3 steps which we see as helpful to achieve net zero. So the first step is making the building's efficiency as efficient as possible, and we use passive house as a way of achieving very ultra low energy buildings. So it's about having a really efficient fabric to begin with. And the second step is considering your heat source, so not using any fossil fuels anymore and moving towards technologies such as heat pumps, which are a low carbon electrical alternative. And the third step is, as I've said before, is just looking at opportunities for renewables on site, so solar panels on roofs. And and I'll pass over back to Irene. You're on mute.
There we go. Just so starting off talking about Melfield Gardens and the brief that we were given by Phoenix, who are a pretty innovative housing association. They had a real vision for this site. It's just up the road from an extra care scheme that we finished for them around 4 or 5 years ago called Hazelhurst Court, which is a really successful first development for them. And they wanted to create a new scheme for older people, but very much more of an independent living model. They didn't want to do another extra care scheme, but they were also really interested in introducing an intergenerational aspect. And so there were sort of 3 key aspects to our brief. If this was the image there is just our initial sort of sketch. We'll come on to our concept sketch. We'll come on to how that's sort of delivered into the real scheme. So if we could have the next slide. So the first of those, as I said, was an intergenerational living aspect. And this for them was very much around sort of an intentional community that they wanted to create, and started having talks with Goldsmith University right at the outset of the project about a possibility for bringing postgraduate students into the scheme as a way of mixing generations, and also coming up with a kind of an agreement where there would be cheaper rents for the students for a commitment to giving a certain amount of time per week or per month back to the residents as a sort of, and then that could obviously have a kind of two-way mutual benefit between the two groups of residents. This is actually the back of Hazelhurst Court, where one of the opening sessions actually, but again, the importance of outdoor spaces where different groups of people, different generations can actually meet. If we go to the next slide. Another aspect was about flexible living and about looking into different types of homes that actually will attract people to come and live here as older people and not stay in their maybe quite difficult to maintain, quite difficult to manage larger family homes. And Phoenix has a lot of stock of houses with people living alone, quite isolated, with houses that are finding increasingly difficult to manage. So one aspect was, what, rather than just a straightforward one-bedroom flat, what could we do to try and make right sizing or downsizing more attractive? And so here we came up with a model of what we call a one-bed plus flat, which has, you can see in the middle there in blue, there's a small room which is smaller than a normal single bedroom, but could be used for a multitude of things, whether a hobby room, space for a carer or a grandchild to come and stay over, or an extension of your living room. And the next slide. And the other aspect, as we've already talked about, was a zero carbon approach. They were really interested in doing a very ultra low energy scheme, all electric, in order just to test out what that means in terms of construction cost, and so that they could look at that as a model for other buildings going forward. This is just an image of our easy guide that we as a practice, because we have been working on passive house schemes for a while, an easy guide that we've produced in-house that is now used much more widely as a sort of step-by-step guide to achieve that. Next slide. So just quickly, the site location, you can see there in red, it's a sort of quite a skinny site. There's an existing block. If we go to the next slide, you can see the aerial views. There's an existing 8-storey block on the site. There's some bedsits that can be taken down and a railway running along the side. Quite low scale neighbourhood apart from that block, and also critically a footpath that connects through from where you can see the cars down the middle, connects through to the road at the top there. So we had to keep that public right of way through the site. On the next slide. The other critical thing when we're looking at the energy aspect of this is that it's a kind of predominantly a site, which means that the blocks have to be sort of east-west facing rather than north-south. So he's going to come on to how that has an impact in terms of the meeting these really ultra-low energy requirements. But we're also really keen to create a heart to the scheme, and the way that the blocks are cranked was part of the way that we're sort of creating a kind of a heart and a focus to the scheme, so that the residents can feel really part of the community and a sort of sense of that they're part of the same development. And that's something that we took from Hazelhurst Court in terms of lessons learned, where we had gallery access. People can see their neighbours coming and going, looking up, looking down. Dual aspect flats are also incredibly important for Phoenix, as they are for us. So next slide, I'm going to rattle through this a little bit, and this gives a sort of 3D view, looking from the east into the site, where to show you how we've kind of elevated that, taking into account the adjacent houses. So we have a 3-storey block and a 5-storey block, and it's an all flatted scheme, a mixture. So they're all the one-bed plus scheme, one-bed plus flats, but also 2 shared flats for the postgraduate students. And so there's a total of 8 students, the intention on the site. If we go to the next slide again. And this is just a sort of a little diagram to show how important it is to create spaces between the buildings where people can interact, bump into each other, have conversations, sit out. And you can see, so we've got lots of front doors, people have their own front doors, lots of overlooking onto that central landscape space, which also has to accommodate people walking through, and also refuse trucks coming through to service the existing block of flats. We also have a small garden room, which is to the sort of top left of the page, which is a space for all of the residents to come together. And that's something that's really important where we're having these intergenerational schemes, that there is some kind of shared space where people can, even if it's just coming in to have a cup of tea, there's somewhere you can go and see if somebody's around. And that has a garden associated with it as well as obviously people have all their own individual terraces or balconies too. And again, that's lessons learned from Hazelhurst in terms of sort of creating this environment where people can see what they're going on, but they can also be private as well if they want to be. So next slide again. And this is a typical floor plan. For those that can read floor plans easily, we've got you can see the sort of white access decks. So those are open to the air, which helps with fire, but also really importantly allows for cross ventilation through those flats, and also windows into kitchens, which single aspect flats, as I'm sure you will realise, you have that blank wall at the back and you only ever get ventilation light from one side. And this is a model that we've delivered at Hazelhurst, but also recently opened a scheme in Preston, where the feedback from residents is the appreciation they have of the sun sort of coming around, seeing it at different times of the day, because older people obviously are in their flats usually for a lot longer during the day than people who are working or out at school. So it's really important that the internal environment is light, airy, and as much, and well ventilated. Next slide. So over to you again, Zoe, talk about the low energy.
Thank you. So just to say, all these ultra low energy design is becoming the new normal. So there are lots of really good case studies and real life built examples around the UK which demonstrate ultra low energy design, such as Agar Grove. We've got Goldsmith Street, but also our own Loudon Road, which we completed 10 years ago, followed passive house principles to really reduce and improve efficiency. So it's really possible across different typologies, and it's not a new technology in that sense. So we go to the next slide.
Actually, just to jump in there, we did some post-occupancy evaluation on that scheme and found that the temperatures were actually really stable across the year, and obviously that also is something that's really important for older people.
Thank you. That's all right. And this diagram just explains passive house design principles, which can also just be ultra low energy design principles, even if you're not going for the passive house standards. These are the criteria you need to look at to meet and improve energy efficiency. So the images on the left demonstrate design principles such as orientation, the efficiency of the form, so how exposed it is to heat loss, so making it more compact is generally more efficient, and the window design are all aspects that are completely free and can be used by the designer if considered right as first principle and integrated within the design, which is something that I think Melfield really did really well, is that the concept of the placemaking really married well with the energy efficiency measures. And on the right, demonstrate kind of high performance fabric and adding more insulation and air tightness and adding mechanical ventilation, all things that might cost a little bit more, but are worthwhile the investment to achieve that standard. So we go to the next slide, thank you. So I'm just breaking down these principles further just to explain what I mean by each of them. So a building form, a less efficient form has lots of kind of pushing and pulling and lots of exposed surfaces for heat loss. So what we're looking for is the kind of more compact form at the bottom. And if we go to the next slide. And as I've already said, we need to target thicker walls constructions. So typically we model at 600 mil thick wall as our starting point, just to allow for those higher performance fabric, and also assuming triple glazing. So we go to the next slide. Orientation is key, and typically a north-south or essentially predominantly south orientation to utilize the free heat from the sun is always a better strategy. But in Melfield, actually, we were able to crank the scheme to allow for a more east-west orientation with some south solar gains. And I think you'll see that in the next slide. So you can see this cranking, even though the majority of the building faces west. The actual cranking creates this really intimate courtyard, which Irene talked about at the beginning, but also allows us to make the building more efficiency. And we spent a lot of time working out the proportions of windows, depending on the orientation and what was most suitable to mitigate overheating, but also benefit from heat gains in the winter. So if we go to the next slide, I think it's Irene.
Yeah, and just very quickly to round up, because I can see we're coming to the end. But so this just gives an indication of how we're looking at the sort of how we treat the different elevations. So on the left, we have a west-facing elevation where we have a real danger of overheating, obviously with rising temperatures as well. And so here we have to work really hard to make sure that we want to get those openings as big as possible to take advantage of solar gain in the winter, but then we're in danger of overheating in summer. But we also want loads of daylight for the residents. So here we're using balconies and canopies to shade those bigger windows, but also here we're looking at external shutters on the larger bedroom windows to really make sure that we're not going to be causing any discomfort, any really high temperatures in the peak of the summer. So that's quite an interesting thing in itself in terms of researching the best products to use that are easy to use for the residents. On the east, it's much less onerous, and there we're actually trying to maximise getting as much solar gain in there as we can, and we don't have that issue with the overhead shading. So next slide. And this is actually the south elevation, which is one of the smallest elevations, but here again, maximising windows as much as possible here with shading where we need it. And the next slide. That's a rather difficult image, we realised, to read, but again, that's the west elevation where we're incorporating all those shading devices. And again, to the next slide, and then a few CGIs just to finish. So this is looking from the top of the site, from across the railway bridge, looking back at the scheme. That's looking at the west elevation there, where we can probably just about make out those shutters. This is walking up with the pedestrian route that continues. You can see the existing block in the background. And finally, going back to that original slide there. So here you can see those access walkways where everybody accesses their own flat, and they can look down into that shared space and see their neighbours coming and going, and just get that feeling of activity and a real sense of community as well. That's what we're hoping to engender, which is what we've been successful with at Hazelhurst Court. So I think that's probably us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of our afternoon speakers. So that's Adrian, Milena, Jenny, Irene and Zoe for a really insightful and interesting afternoon session. We've got about, we've got about 20 to 25 minutes or so where I thought we could do a Q&A session with all of the afternoon speakers. I've tried to pick up most of the questions that were the most engaged throughout the afternoon session. So without further ado, the first question I'm going to approach is towards Adrian and Milena, and it was a question that came through whilst you guys were talking, and it was more of an open question really, and it said, do you believe as a society we've fallen out of the habit of shared living?
Yeah, our answer is yes. We definitely moved away from this quite prevalent living model in the past, but there's also growing evidence that there is the tendency to move back to it, and that tendency needs to be sort of catered for. And the reasons for it are very complex. There's also cultural reasons. So perhaps the model has been probably reintroduced by ethnic minorities, populations, but there's also reacting to the pressure of contemporary living with the housing crisis, cost of childcare, and the needs of the elderly. So yeah, the answer is yes, but there is a movement back to it.
Yeah, and I think also in general, new housing, or the majority of new housing in general, doesn't support that way of living. So yeah, as the evidence is showing, it's ad hoc intergenerational living that's on the rise. It's not in a formalized setting. So there is a need to get back to it, and formalise it to stop things like overcrowding and other problems associated with housing that isn't suitable for that kind of use.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Milena. I might stay on the theme of your session quickly, because there were a couple of other questions whilst you guys were presenting. There was a question that had quite a lot of engagement that said it would be interesting to see if the isolation of the pandemic stroke restrictions on housing has increased receptiveness to the model that you guys spoke through. Has this been explored at all?
Well, we don't have updated figures. CBRE hasn't got updated figures on that, but the anecdotal evidence would suggest that it's on people's minds. Loneliness is on people's minds, and being with their loved ones, being with their elderly relatives is on people's minds. So yes, anecdotal evidence would support bringing those two generations together. I think what for us, our next step would be to go to communities where we know intergenerational living is already prevalent, and kind of gauge that appetite, and we can see if these last couple of years have really got people thinking in those terms a bit more.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Let's move over to Irene and Zoe. There was a question that came through whilst you guys were presenting, and it said, does net zero include energy used in the actual construction process and the making of materials as well? Does that count towards the net zero?
I'm still out here, Irene. Shall I answer that one?
No, that's fine. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, absolutely. That's what we probably should have prefaced it, that the brief for this project was focused around passive design and the operational energy. But in order to achieve net zero, and whole life carbon is really important. So the actual embodied carbon within the materials themselves, which you would achieve through being efficient as possible, essentially, and lean with your design. So not using lots of materials in the first place, and also targeting, in an ideal world, natural materials, although fire and regulations make it more challenging these days, but we should definitely be pushing for that in the industry.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Zoe. There's a question here which I think is for pretty much everyone to potentially opine on. I might start with Jenny and then open it to the other presenters as well, because I think you all might have an opinion or a point of view on it. And this question said, how do you all find the uptake on apartments for older people? They said, I tend to see that the ground floor apartments are very popular, then the first, second and above floors are less desirable and take longer to let out. So Jenny, I was wondering if we could get your opinion on that first of all, and then I might hand over to one of the other speakers for their opinions.
I think it varies from development to development. So to say in West Byfleet there aren't any ground floor apartments. There are apartments nevertheless onto terraces in the upper levels. I think it's to do with those on the ground floor quite often go to people who like the access to the garden, and that's key to them. But we do hear from feedback that there are a lot of people who don't like the ground floor because they worry about security and privacy. So their preferable would be an upper floor apartment. We are seeing quite a lot of a resurgence of bungalows and cottages, both in the private and the affordable sector. So we've got a scheme in Swindon with Nationwide that's got a variety of apartments and bungalows in that. But I think it just varies from scheme to scheme. It depends on the location of the development, to be quite honest.
Fantastic. I'll pass you over to Irene next, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with Jenny. I think it's obviously partly a personal preference, and ground floor can have, particularly more urban environments, can have downsides about privacy, people whether they feel secure or not. But I mean, the great benefit of having a flat higher up is that you get amazing views, and if you are in your home, during the day, maybe more than most, then that is a real benefit. We actually worked on a scheme in Hackney back in the late 90s, quite soon after I joined Levitt Bernstein, which was part of a big estate regeneration, but it was actually the refurbishment of there were 4 tower blocks on the estate, and 3 were taken down. 1 was kept, and Hackney Council decided that it was going to be suitable. The best use for it was actually for the over 55s, which was actually really forward thinking at the time, rather than putting families in there, which we know has lots of problems. And it's a 22-storey tower, and they had absolutely no problem letting those flats. They were completely repurposed, redesigned, went back to the frame. And with winter gardens rather than balconies, I think you have to, as you get higher up, you have to think about protection as well for residents. And it might be that open balconies, particularly when you get really high, aren't going to be suitable. So winter gardens, which we've used on another of our schemes in Hackney, the Blue House, gives it sort of added protection that you can open up as well during the summer, or if you're feeling, you know, less nervous about those things. But the views from those are amazing.
Fantastic. No, it's really brilliant to hear. It's also very promising to hear, I think, as well, that those upper floors aren't being neglected either. I'll just go over to Adrian. I don't know if you or Milena had any other additional thoughts on that area.
I think in the line of Irene's answer, it kind of depends on the nature of the amenity, really. And yeah, so we are providing those terraces that can be shared or not, but because of the profile of the building, yeah, we think that's going to be a point of attraction at every level, to be fair.
I think there's a slight sort of stigma about being on the ground floor, or having seen to be needing to be on the ground floor, which also feels sort of less independent. And I think the elderly people are natural carers, and I remember hearing a comedian talk on the radio about growing up on his estate. And he would say that his grandma would always should be on the second floor, and she'd be shouting down to the kids, telling them that they shouldn't be doing this or shouldn't be doing that. And that was just part of growing up. And I think that natural overlooking is important and inclusive as well, not only for the people downstairs playing, but also for those on the upper floors who are able to feel part of that. So I don't see why it should be limited to ground floor. I think let's open it up.
That's really interesting.
Perhaps the key is actually having larger balconies, big enough balconies in the upper floors to make it equitable with the ground floor ones. Because if that's the feedback, is that some of the upper floor ones are being less easy to let, it might be purely because of the size of balconies in the upper floors as much as anything else.
Okay, that's really interesting to know. Thank you, everyone. There was another kind of more broad question, which would be interesting to get the panel's points of view on. It's quite a lengthy one, so I'll read it out in full. So it says, as local authorities, a key role is to support the provision of appropriate housing for older people via their local plan. There's often a view that older people can be a drain on local finances. They put in brackets, not my view. I have no real understanding of the economic balance. I was wondering if anyone has a view on this in the panel. Is there any truth in this? And if so, are local authorities less likely to promote and encourage older persons housing with the fear it could negatively impact their finances, demand for certain services? I'll go in the same order again, I think, if that's okay, because it'd be interesting to get everyone's points of view on this area as well. So I think I started with Jenny, and we'll go through a similar route.
I've just put something in the chat there, which is from like Frank's Senior Housing Annual Review. And I think I've had this said to me by local authorities, who shall not be named, but in areas near the seaside, that if we build older people's housing, we're going to encourage older people to retire to the sea. And that means they will then move into our area, and we will have more older people who've not necessarily given to the economy in our area. I think that diagram is information they've produced. They've collated data, and that they say in the affordable sector, 85% of residents in housing with care models, i.e. extra care, 85% of those residents have moved within 10 miles. And I think that's really an interesting bit of data, because it's not about, if those people have lived in those communities all their lives, and you're providing them with something that is going to enable them to be as active for as long as they possibly can, and you're actually given something that's a real enabling environment for them to live their life to the full, next to the facilities that they need to access easily, you're actually probably reducing the cost on the public purse. And whenever we get those sorts of approaches from local authorities, I think it's not really understanding that people generally are not moving hundreds of miles when they retire. They're generally moving to, if they do move into a local authority, it's usually because their families are there. There's some sort of connection. So I think it's a little bit short-sighted. I think if you don't provide any older people's housing in your authority, then you're actually disadvantaging those local people who live there, who might want to move into something more suitable for them as they get older.
Fantastic.
I could add to that as well, Jenny, because I think probably some of your schemes have been part of research around extra care, particularly. I think there's been quite a lot of research about the benefits in terms of health benefits to the residents in extra care compared to if they stayed in their own homes for longer and then probably moved in crisis into probably a care home. So actually, moving into something like an extra care scheme, as Jenny said, means that they're promoting independence for longer. It's going to give them more support in a more appropriate home, and they're less likely to have that kind of crisis where they're going to end up in hospital and then probably go into a care home, which is hugely more expensive for a local authority to deal with. And then there's also probably less impact in terms of GPs and all the rest of it. So there's research out there that suggests that if we're designing and providing the right kind of housing, they will be less of a burden than they probably are at the moment. So it's about providing the right kind of housing in all of our boroughs. And it's not just seaside councils that we hear that from either, Jenny, is it? I think it's sometimes even London. But it's a lack of understanding, I think, about what the right kind of housing, what benefits and opportunities it can really bring,
That's great. Thank you, Irene. Adrian and Milena, I don't mind who wants to go first. If you've got any thoughts on this, I'll go to Milena first of all.
Yeah, I mean, in order to facilitate what Irene and Jenny have put forward, which we totally agree with, it's about providing the right infrastructure, and we have concentrated on the sort of spatial infrastructure for that intergenerational exchange to happen, because then you maximize the amount of what the elderly can offer back to the community, and oftentimes that can't be quantified in the short term, but definitely research shows that on a sort of a longer term, the benefits to the community are huge. And
yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is, I mean, it's being proven to work. I mean, we did a talk with Belong and Ready Generations, and they've just set up a care home in Chester, which has a nursery within the care home, and the elderly come down, and they're free to go in, speak to the kids, and the kids benefit from that interaction as well. So it's about giving back, and hopefully costs associated with care will come down because there's mutual benefit there. Yeah.
The other aspect, Rory, if I can jump in again, in terms of costs to local authorities, is thinking about their housing stock, because one of the huge benefits that Phoenix found, and I talk about this all the time, so apologies to those who've heard me already, when they built Hazelhurst Court, which is 60 extra care flats, they've got quite a lot of stock in one specific area of Lewisham, because they were a stock transfer housing association, and they had a lot of elderly people living alone in family houses because their partners had died, their families had moved on, children had moved out, and they were really not coping very well. And so they found that the benefit of building 60 extra care flats created a huge amount of then beneficial moves for people who were maybe living in overcrowded accommodation elsewhere in their estate. So they were able to move families out of, say, 2-bedroom flats into 3-bedroom houses with gardens. And that's another. It's a kind of very small part of trying, solving the housing crisis, which is the much bigger picture for the whole country. But that's something as well that local authorities can, really should be thinking about. That these schemes can deliver. Phoenix got hundreds of moves because of these 60 extra care flats. So that's something else, that is, in terms of saving money and allowing people to move into the right kind of housing, it's really important.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for that, Irene. Just looking at a couple more things. There was one which I think was approached towards Jenny, and it's probably more of a case study specific one. And it said, has there been any resistance from the older person's residents about having non-residents sharing internal community space within that wider community, apart from organised events? I guess a few of you have probably got other case studies with similar stories, and it'd be interesting to hear if there has been any kind of examples of that.
I have that West Byfleet's not built yet. It's about to go on site in the next few months, so we'll be able to tell you a bit more about that. But I do have experience of this, because we do go back and revisit our schemes, and I would say that there's one that I can specifically think about, which was part of a larger master plan, and it was one of the first phases on the master plan. So it was built prior to a lot of the surrounding housing being completed, and the intention had always been that residents in the local area would come and use those facilities. But because on day one there were no other residents, there was only the residents in the building, the communal facilities weren't particularly used. And as the housing around this extra care scheme became, more people moved into the area, the residents in the extra care scheme were then actually trying to say, no, this is our space that we pay for, you can't come in. So I would say that I think it works really well, but on day one, you have to make it open to the wider public. You can't introduce that later down the line, because that's when it doesn't work, because it seems unfair. I've moved in, this was our space, and now you're telling us this is everybody's space. So it's about the management of that and making it very clear on day one that it is open to the wider community, and how it benefits the residents in the scheme. Because when people come in and they spend their money in those facilities, it means that that's keeping the resident service charges down. So there's a mutual benefit there. So it is important from day one that it is presented in that way, I would say, and it also has to be reflected in the design.
Brilliant, thanks, Jenny. I don't know if Irene, you've got any comments on that as well?
I've probably got less direct experience of those kind of more public-facing spaces, but I mean, it is something that in terms of the schemes we're looking at now and the briefs that we're getting, a lot of our clients are thinking much more outwardly now, not just about, what can I produce for our own residents. We completed a scheme which got planning last year for Westminster Council, which incorporates a cafe. This isn't rocket science. This is nothing particularly new, but they were really keen to have a cafe that opened out onto the much more public part of the scheme that will be open to public and to the residents. The only person who didn't seem to like it was a secure by design officer who was really worried about the public mixing with the residents for some reason. But and the residents don't have to go down to that cafe if they don't want to. They can just go straight through reception and access their flats. And so it's also thinking about the internal arrangements. And as I said on the presentation, if people want to be private and don't want to join in, then that's fine as well. It's having the choice to do both, I think.
Brilliant. And then Adrian Mullane, I don't know if you've got any case studies or any examples through your architectural firm of this kind of thing.
Not directly, to be honest, and listening to Irene and Jenny there, I think we're kind of bow to their expertise on it, and we're sort of learning a little from them there. So yeah, we'll sit back on this one.
Not a problem at all, no worries. I think that might actually be all we've got time for in today's session. So thanks to all of our speakers today and to everyone for attending today's session. So if you have any more specific questions for any of our Homes England colleagues, please do reach out to your relationship managers. If you're unsure of who your relationship manager is, please do reach out to the Local Government Capacity Centre team. The email address you can see hopefully in the middle of your screen there, but I'll read it out as well. And that is cce@homesengland.gov.uk. So I think that wraps it up for today. Thank you so much all for attending, and thank you to all of our excellent presenters throughout the duration of today. From all of us here at Homes England, thank you very much and goodbye.